Welcome to Netheric Horror. Tonight, enter a world of true scary stories, soft narration, and gentle rain. Close your eyes, relax, and let the darkness take you deeper. Sweet dreams, if you dare. About 4 years ago, I woke up late one morning on a day off, and the clock beside my bed read 10:21. I remember that exact number with complete clarity. And by the end of this story, you will understand exactly why that specific time has stayed burned into my memory for 4 full years afterward, refusing to fade the way most ordinary morning details eventually do. I got out of bed the way I normally would on any lazy day off, used the restroom, took my time getting dressed, went through my usual unhurried morning routine without any particular urgency, since I had nowhere to be and nothing pressing to attend to, the kind of relaxed pace that only comes with genuinely having an entire free day stretched out ahead of you. Eventually, I wandered back into my bedroom and picked up my phone to check for any messages that might have come in while I slept. The clock on my phone read 10:25. That struck me as immediately strange, because I knew for a fact that getting dressed and going through my morning routine had taken considerably longer than 4 minutes. I had lingered in the warm bathroom for quite a while, in no rush at all, enjoying the warmth and taking my time, and had brushed my teeth thoroughly on top of everything else, going through the whole unhurried process at a pace that could not possibly have wrapped up in under 5 minutes total. 4 minutes simply did not add up with how much time I actually knew had passed since waking up. Wanting to confirm what I was seeing, I looked over at my bedroom alarm clock, the same clock I had originally checked when I first woke up at 10:21. It also read 10:25. At that point, still groggy and not fully alert from having just woken up, I simply shrugged the discrepancy off, assuming I had probably misread the original 10:21 in my sleepy, half-awake state, and that the actual time I first checked must have been closer to whatever would make the math work out properly. It felt like the kind of small, forgettable mistake anyone might make first thing in the morning, nothing worth dwelling on any further. The sort of minor confusion that happens naturally when your brain hasn't fully caught up with wakefulness yet. I made my way downstairs, turned on my computer, switched on the television to catch some news in the background while I got breakfast started. Moving through my usual morning sequence without much conscious thought behind any of it, the kind of automatic routine that happens almost without thinking after enough repetition. I decided I wanted to microwave some leftover rice from the night before, so I walked over to pop it in and glanced at the microwave's clock display, out of habit, while I waited for it to heat. Something I did almost unconsciously every single time I used that appliance. The time read 10:25. I immediately pulled out my phone to check the time there as well, and it still read 10:25, matching the microwave exactly, the two devices agreeing perfectly with each other in a way that should have felt reassuring, but instead only deepened my growing unease. Something about that felt deeply wrong. There was simply no possible way that checking the clock upstairs, walking all the way down to the kitchen, turning on both the computer and the television, getting myself a glass of water, and starting to prepare breakfast could have all happened within less than a single minute. That sequence of actions typically took me several minutes at minimum under any normal circumstances, involving multiple separate trips between rooms and several distinct tasks that simply could not be compressed into such a tiny window of time, and yet somehow, according to every clock I checked, barely any time at all had passed. I decided to actually test this directly, rather than simply dismissing it again the way I had upstairs. I stood there in the kitchen, staring directly at the microwave's digital display, and began silently counting to 60 in my head, reasoning that if the display failed to advance to 10:26 within that 60-second window, Something was clearly malfunctioning with the appliance itself. The display changed to 10:26 about 20 seconds into my count, which actually made logical sense given that it had presumably already been sitting at 10:25 for some stretch of time before I ever glanced at it. That small confirmation offered a brief moment of relief, a sense that maybe everything really was functioning normally after all, and that I had simply caught the display at an unlucky moment during my earlier checks. I finished preparing my breakfast, plated everything up, and carried it over to my computer desk the way I always did on days off, settling in to eat alone while catching up on whatever was happening online. The familiar routine of a lazy morning finally starting to feel normal again after those 2 brief moments of confusion earlier. I glanced at the clock displayed on my computer screen as I sat down. It read 10:20. I immediately pulled my phone back out to check again, and it also read 10:20, matching the computer exactly. 2 entirely separate devices, somehow agreeing on a time that had already, unmistakably, passed several minutes earlier according to everything I had already personally witnessed and confirmed myself. That was the exact moment everything shifted from mild, dismissible confusion into something considerably more unsettling. This was no longer a simple matter of misreading a number while still half asleep, or catching an appliance's clock at an inconvenient moment mid-transition. The time had now visibly moved backward, not forward, contradicting every basic rule I understood about how time was supposed to function. Every fundamental assumption I had held my entire life about the reliability of clocks and the steady, unstoppable forward march of minutes and seconds. That was also the exact moment I decided I needed to start writing everything down as it happened, documenting each observation in real time so I would have some kind of record to refer back to later, in case my own memory of events started to feel unreliable or impossible to trust. A decision that in hindsight probably saved this entire story from dissolving into vague, unconvincing recollection years later. I pulled up the small clock toolbar in the corner of my computer screen and simply watched the second hand sweep steadily around its circular path, my full attention locked on to that small display in a way I had never before found myself paying such close, deliberate attention to something as mundane as a clock. While I actively watched it, time seemed to behave completely normally, ticking forward from 10:20 to 10:21, and then on to 10:22 exactly as I observed the seconds passing by in real time, each tick landing exactly where it should, exactly when it should, with no hint whatsoever of anything unusual happening, as long as my eyes remained locked directly onto that display. But the moment I looked away from it, for any meaningful stretch, at least 2 minutes or so, distracted by something else in the room or simply needing to check on my breakfast or glance at the television, and then look back again, the numbers simply stopped making any coherent sense whatsoever. Over what felt like roughly an hour, maybe closer to an hour and a half in total, every single clock throughout my house, including various clocks I checked online through my phone and computer, continued behaving completely normally for as long as I kept my direct attention fixed on them, second by second, minute by minute, exactly as expected. The moment my attention shifted elsewhere, even briefly, even for what felt like an entirely ordinary and unremarkable lapse in focus, the numbers would jump around unpredictably whenever I looked back again, refusing to correspond in any logical way with whatever I had last observed before looking away. At one particular point, roughly 15 minutes into this entire strange episode, both my cell phone and my computer simultaneously displayed 10:14. A time that had already passed by a significant margin according to any reasonable accounting of how much time had elapsed since I first woke up and began documenting everything happening around me. A little while after that, the displayed time shifted again, this time reading 10:13, moving even further backward than before, sliding deeper into a version of the morning I had already lived through and carefully recorded in my notes. And then, without any clear pattern or logic connecting these shifts together, the numbers jumped back into the 10:20 range once more, as though whatever was happening simply couldn't settle on any consistent direction, forward or backward, for any sustained stretch of time, bouncing erratically between numbers that made no coherent sense when placed alongside each other in any kind of logical sequence. I spent that entire hour, maybe hour and a half, in a state of genuine, mounting unease, constantly checking and rechecking every clock I could find throughout the house, cross-referencing my phone against my computer, against the microwave, against my bedroom alarm clock, running back and forth between rooms at one point just to compare readings simultaneously, trying desperately to find some pattern, some logical explanation, anything at all that might make sense of what I was experiencing. Nothing ever did. The only consistent rule I managed to identify, the only thing that held steady no matter how many times I tested it, was that direct, sustained observation seemed to keep time moving forward in an ordinary, predictable fashion. While any lapse in attention, any moment where my focus shifted elsewhere even briefly, allowed the numbers to scramble themselves into some inexplicable new configuration entirely disconnected from whatever had come immediately before. I remember sitting there at my desk, breakfast slowly going cold beside me, completely unable to focus on eating despite having been genuinely hungry just moments earlier, my mind racing through every possible explanation I could think of while my fork sat mostly untouched on the plate. Was my phone malfunctioning somehow? And if so, why had my bedroom alarm clock and my computer and my microwave all apparently synchronized themselves to the exact same malfunction independently? 4 completely separate devices from different manufacturers, running on entirely different internal systems, somehow all agreeing on the same impossible readings at the same impossible moments. Was there some kind of household-wide electrical issue affecting every device simultaneously? And if that were the case, why would sustained visual attention seemingly stabilize the readings while looking away allowed them to shift again? A detail that no ordinary electrical malfunction could reasonably explain, no matter how I tried to frame it. None of the explanations I could construct actually held together logically once I tried applying them against everything I had personally witnessed and carefully documented throughout that strange stretch of morning, each new theory collapsing under its own weight, the moment I tested it against the specific, consistent pattern I kept observing again and again. Eventually, after what genuinely felt like an hour and a half of this bizarre, unsettling experience, everything simply normalized on its own, without any clear trigger or obvious explanation for why it stopped exactly when it did. No dramatic moment or sudden realization that preceded the return to normalcy. The clocks throughout my house began behaving completely predictably again, advancing steadily, minute by minute, in perfect, boring, ordinary synchronization with each other, exactly the way clocks are supposed to function under any normal circumstance, the kind of mundane reliability I had taken entirely for granted my entire life up until that particular morning. I sat there for a long while afterward, simply staring at my computer screen, watching the time continue advancing normally, waiting nervously to see whether the strangeness might return again at any moment, half expecting the numbers to scramble themselves once more the instant I let my guard down. It never did. Not that day, and not in the 4 years since. I have never experienced anything remotely similar since that particular morning. Not once in all the years that have passed. I have gone on to live an otherwise completely ordinary life, checking clocks and calendars every single day without ever encountering that same unsettling disconnect between observation and reality that defined those roughly 90 minutes so many years ago. A stretch of time that remains, to this day, entirely isolated within my personal history, with nothing before or since ever coming close to matching it. And yet the memory of that morning has never faded, has never softened into something I can comfortably dismiss as simple exhaustion or a temporary electronic glitch affecting every device in my house simultaneously. I have tried many times over the years to construct some kind of rational explanation that would neatly account for everything I experienced and carefully documented that morning. I have wondered about the possibility of some strange coincidental electrical malfunction affecting my entire home's various devices simultaneously. Some kind of power surge or electromagnetic interference that might explain multiple clocks displaying inconsistent readings at roughly the same time, perhaps triggered by something happening within the local power grid that I would have had no way of knowing about or verifying afterward. But that explanation has never fully satisfied me, particularly given the specific, consistent pattern I observed, the way direct observation seemed to stabilize the readings while looking away allowed them to shift unpredictably. That specific detail has never fit comfortably into any purely mechanical or electrical explanation I have ever managed to construct, no matter how many angles I have tried approaching it from since. No matter how many hours I have spent turning the whole experience over in my mind, searching for some overlooked, more mundane possibility. I have also considered, honestly and without dismissing the possibility outright, whether I might have simply been more disoriented from sleep than I initially realized, whether some combination of grogginess and misreading might account for at least the earlier portion of that strange sequence of events. The part where I first noticed the clocks disagreeing with my own internal sense of elapsed time. But that explanation falls apart entirely once it reaches the point where I was actively standing in my kitchen, fully alert and specifically counting seconds against the microwave's display to test my own perception deliberately, and later sitting fully awake at my computer, consciously watching a digital clock's second hand sweep steadily forward while documenting everything I observed in real time as it happened. By that point in the morning, any reasonable explanation involving simple sleepiness or misperception had already been thoroughly ruled out through my own careful, deliberate testing. Testing I conducted specifically because I suspected, even in the moment, that my own perception might eventually be questioned by anyone I later chose to tell this story to. What continues to unsettle me most about that entire experience, even now, 4 years removed from it, is the specific, consistent relationship between observation and the apparent behavior of time itself throughout that strange morning. As long as I watched the clock directly, time behaved exactly the way it always should, advancing steadily and predictably, second by second, minute by minute, in perfect, ordinary fashion, exactly matching everything I had ever understood about how clocks and time were supposed to function together. But the instant my attention shifted away, even for what felt like a relatively brief span of just a couple of minutes, everything I returned to find made no coherent sense whatsoever. Jumping backward, forward, and back again with no discernible pattern connecting any of it together into something logically consistent, as though the entire concept of steady, linear time only applied whenever someone happened to be actively watching it unfold. I have wondered in some of my more speculative moments over the years since whether there might be some deeper significance to that specific relationship between observation and apparent temporal consistency. Some connection to ideas about perception and reality that go far beyond anything I feel remotely qualified to properly analyze or explain with any real confidence. Ideas that occasionally surface in popular science writing about quantum mechanics and the role of observation. though I hesitate to draw any serious parallel given how little I genuinely understand about that field beyond the most casual, surface-level familiarity. I am not a physicist, not a philosopher, just an ordinary person who happened to experience something profoundly strange on an otherwise unremarkable day off. Something that defied every rational explanation I have ever managed to construct in the years since it happened. No matter how many books or articles I have occasionally skimmed through, hoping to find some comparable account or theoretical framework that might shed light on what actually occurred that morning. I kept the notes I wrote that morning, the ones I started jotting down the moment I realized the time had inexplicably moved backward rather than forward. I still have them somewhere, tucked away in an old notebook, documenting each specific time I observed on each specific device throughout that entire strange stretch of morning, complete with rough timestamps of my own noting roughly how long I had spent watching versus how long I had looked away before each new discrepancy appeared. Looking back at those notes now, I am struck by how frantic my handwriting becomes partway through the entries, the letters growing increasingly rushed and less legible as the morning wore on, and my nerves became more and more frayed by each new impossible reading. I looked back at those notes occasionally, usually when this particular memory resurfaces unprompted during some ordinary conversation about strange personal experiences, and I am struck every single time by how carefully and methodically I documented everything as it happened. How genuinely determined I was in that moment to create some kind of reliable record I could trust later. Precisely because some part of me already understood, even as it was actively happening, that no one would fully believe this story without some form of contemporaneous evidence to back it up. There is something particularly unsettling, looking back, about how quickly I shifted from casual dismissal to genuine, documented alarm over the course of that single morning. In the span of maybe 20 or 30 minutes, I went from a person mildly confused about a 4-minute discrepancy to someone standing frozen at their kitchen counter, deliberately counting seconds under their breath just to confirm their own sanity, my heart rate climbing steadily with each new impossible detail that refused to fit into any framework I could construct on the fly. That escalation, looking back at it now, feels almost as significant as the strange time discrepancies themselves. A clear marker of exactly how quickly an ordinary, mundane morning can tip over into something that fundamentally challenges your basic assumptions about how reality is supposed to function around you. How thin the line actually is between comfortable, unquestioned normalcy and genuine, disorienting uncertainty about the most basic rules governing the world you live in. I don't share this story particularly often, mostly because I understand exactly how it sounds to anyone hearing it secondhand, without having personally lived through the specific, methodical experience of watching multiple independent clocks throughout an entire house behave in ways that simply should not be possible, according to any ordinary understanding of how time and electronic devices are supposed to function, ways that no reasonable person would readily accept on faith alone without some kind of first-hand encounter of their own. People tend to react in one of two predictable ways whenever I do bring it up, and over the years I have gotten fairly good at anticipating which reaction is coming, based simply on how the conversation begins. Some immediately reach for practical explanations, suggesting perhaps a widespread local power fluctuation, or some obscure software bug affecting multiple synced devices simultaneously. Theories that sound reasonable enough on the surface, but that consistently fail to account for the specific detail that has always bothered me most, the way sustained observation itself seemed to matter, seemed to actively influence whether the numbers behaved themselves or scrambled into nonsense the moment I looked away. Others simply go quiet, sitting with the strangeness of it the way people do when a story genuinely unsettles them rather than immediately rushing to disprove or explain it away. Occasionally admitting afterward that they have never quite heard anything terrible before and don't really know what to make of it either. But for those rare occasions when I do share it, I always find myself returning to the same core, undeniable facts. The ones I documented carefully as they happened, rather than reconstructing entirely from memory afterward. Facts that have remained perfectly consistent every single time I have revisited my original notes over these past 4 years. I woke up at 10:21, 4 minutes and an entire lengthy morning routine later. Multiple independent clocks throughout my house all read 10:25. Later still, after additional activity that should have taken considerably longer than a single minute, my computer and phone both read 10:20. A clear step backward in time that defied any reasonable explanation. And throughout the roughly 90 minutes that followed, time continued behaving normally only for as long as I kept my direct attention fixed on whatever clock I happened to be watching in that particular moment. A pattern so consistent and so easily testable that I found myself repeating the experiment, deliberately, multiple times throughout that strange stretch of morning, hoping each time that the results might somehow come out differently, and yet finding, every single time, that they never did. I have no satisfying conclusion to offer for any of this, no neat explanation that ties everything together into something comfortably rational and easily dismissed. I simply know what I experienced, what I carefully documented as it happened specifically, because some part of me recognized immediately how important it would be to have a reliable record rather than relying entirely on memory alone. A decision I have never once regretted in the years since, even as the experience itself has remained every bit as inexplicable now as it was on that particular morning, resisting every attempt I have made to fold it neatly back into the ordinary, predictable world I otherwise live within. 4 years later, I still think about that strange morning fairly often. Still find myself occasionally glancing twice at ordinary clocks throughout my day, half expecting, in some small, persistent corner of my mind, that I might someday look away for a moment too long and return to find the numbers no longer making any sense whatsoever, exactly the way they once didn't on that particular otherwise unremarkable day off, 4 years ago now, when time itself seemed to briefly forget how it was supposed to behave. I have thought, more than once, about how strange it is that something so seemingly mundane, nothing more dramatic than a series of digital clock displays refusing to cooperate with each other, could leave such a lasting psychological impact on me. An impact that has genuinely outlasted many other, objectively more dramatic experiences I have had over the years since. There were no visible apparitions that morning, no strange sounds or physical sensations beyond my own mounting anxiety. Nothing that fits neatly into the traditional shape of a typical ghost story or supernatural encounter that people usually expect when this kind of story gets told. And yet, the quiet, methodical wrongness of that entire experience has stayed with me far more persistently than I would have ever predicted beforehand. Precisely because it attacked something so fundamental, so deeply assumed and taken for granted, the basic, unquestioned reliability of time itself moving forward in one single, consistent direction. A rule I had simply never before considered might not always hold. I sometimes wonder whether other people have experienced something similar, whether this particular kind of strange temporal disruption is more common than most people realize, simply because so few individuals would ever think to document it as carefully and methodically as I happened to that particular morning, or because so many who do experience something comparable simply choose never to speak of it at all, worried about exactly the kind of skeptical reaction I have occasionally encountered myself over these past 4 years. Or perhaps even worried about what it might say about their own mental state to admit that clocks in their own home once stopped making sense for the better part of an hour and a half. I have searched at various points for other accounts online that might describe something even remotely similar to what I experienced, hoping to find some validation, some indication that I wasn't simply alone in having lived through this particular kind of impossible morning. Scrolling through forums and old discussion threads late at night more times than I would probably like to admit, I have found scattered stories here and there that touch on vaguely similar themes, moments of perceived temporal displacement or strange clock malfunctions reported by other people in various corners of the internet, but nothing that has ever matched my own experience closely enough in its specific details, particularly that consistent relationship between observation and stability, to feel like genuine confirmation rather than simple coincidental overlap. What I keep returning to, more than anything else, whenever I revisit this particular memory, is the sheer ordinariness of everything surrounding it. This wasn't some remote, isolated location known for strange occurrences, wasn't some historically significant site with a documented history of unexplained phenomena. Nothing like the kinds of settings that typically feature in stories people tell about ghosts or hauntings or other unexplainable events. It was simply my own house, on an entirely unremarkable day off, during a morning that began exactly like countless other lazy mornings before and since, filled with nothing more dramatic than plans to eat breakfast, catch up on the news, and enjoy a bit of quiet time alone before whatever the rest of the day might bring. That ordinariness, more than anything else about the actual experience itself, is what continues to unsettle me most whenever I think back on it now. If something this genuinely strange and inexplicable could happen during such a completely mundane stretch of time, in such an unremarkable setting, surrounded by nothing more unusual than ordinary household electronics, then perhaps the boundary between ordinary reality and something else entirely is considerably thinner and more permeable than most of us ever allow ourselves to seriously consider during the ordinary course of our daily lives, tucked away quietly behind the comfortable, predictable routines we rarely think to question. A friend of mine and I were driving home from high school one ordinary afternoon. Nothing unusual about the day at all. Just two teenagers heading home after classes the way we did most days of the week, talking about whatever small, unremarkable things fill up ordinary teenage conversation on a typical drive home. It was the kind of routine, forgettable afternoon that blends together with countless other similar afternoons in memory, the sort of day nobody would normally think twice about years later. We came to a stop at a red light at a fairly major intersection, a kind of busy crossing with multiple lanes running in every direction, cars lined up, waiting their turn, just like ours. The usual rhythm of afternoon traffic moving steadily around us. When the left turn signal finally switched to green, my friend accelerated, maybe just a little too eagerly, his tires actually peeling out slightly against the pavement as he pulled forward. The kind of small, harmless burst of enthusiasm that teenage drivers sometimes show off without thinking too much about who might be watching. A momentary lapse in judgment that felt completely inconsequential at the time. That small, thoughtless moment turned out to matter far more than either of us could have possibly anticipated. Almost immediately, a green pickup truck that had been sitting behind us at the light suddenly sped up and pulled alongside us on our left. Moving with a kind of aggressive urgency that instantly put me on edge, the engine noise noticeably louder and more aggressive than ordinary traffic sounds around us. I glanced over and saw the driver, a bald man with a genuinely intimidating presence, thick-set and clearly agitated, clearly yelling something in our direction, his mouth moving rapidly. his expression twisted with obvious anger, even though his window remained rolled up the entire time, muffling whatever exact words he was shouting at us, leaving us only with the unmistakable visual impression of pure, unfiltered rage directed squarely at two teenagers who had done nothing more than accelerate slightly too enthusiastically at a green light. Unfortunately, we found ourselves approaching another red light shortly afterward, and I quickly alerted my friend as the same truck pulled up right beside us once again, this time positioned directly on our left at the light itself, close enough that there was no mistaking his intention to make direct contact with us in some way. His truck angled slightly toward ours in a manner that felt deliberately intimidating rather than accidental. The driver made an unmistakable gesture, motioning for us to roll down our window, clearly wanting to communicate something directly, rather than simply yelling through closed glass the way he had at the previous intersection. We tried to decline as politely and non-confrontationally as possible, shaking our heads and avoiding direct eye contact, hoping he would simply lose interest and move on with whatever was clearly bothering him, both of us silently praying the light would change quickly and give us an easy, natural excuse to simply drive away without further confrontation. Instead, what happened next has stayed burned into my memory ever since. The man raised his hand and shaped it deliberately into the unmistakable form of a gun, extending it toward us with obvious, calculated intention, his thumb cocked back like a hammer, his index finger extended directly toward our car with chilling precision. He pointed that hand directly at us first, holding the gesture just long enough for its meaning to fully register, his eyes locked onto ours through the glass separating our vehicles. And then, almost as if to make his message even more explicit and terrifying, he turned that same hand toward his own head and mimed pulling the trigger against his own temple, his expression shifting in that instant from pure aggression toward something darker and more difficult to fully categorize, something that felt genuinely unstable rather than simply angry. The gesture was unmistakable, deliberate, clearly meant to communicate something genuinely threatening rather than any kind of harmless joke or misunderstanding. And I remember feeling every ounce of blood drain from my face in that instant, my entire body flooding with a fear unlike anything I had ever experienced before in my sheltered teenage life up to that point. Before either of us could fully process what we had just witnessed, he began reaching toward his glove compartment, his movements suddenly urgent and purposeful in a way that immediately triggered every alarm bell in both our minds simultaneously, every instinct screaming that we needed to escape immediately rather than wait to see exactly what he might be reaching for. At that exact moment, thankfully, the light turned green. My friend and I looked at each other for one brief, terrified second, both of our faces reflecting the exact same pure fear. And then he floored the accelerator while we both screamed, the sound tearing out of us involuntarily as pure adrenaline took over completely, drowning out any coherent thought beyond the single, overwhelming need to put as much distance as possible between ourselves and that truck. The truck peeled out immediately behind us, and within seconds he was tailing us closely, practically riding our bumper, weaving slightly as he pushed his vehicle to keep pace with whatever speed my friend was pushing our own car toward, his headlights filling our rearview mirror in a way that felt suffocating and inescapable. I remember gripping the door handle so tightly my knuckles went white, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, my mind racing through every possible outcome of this situation, none of them good, imagining with horrifying clarity exactly what might happen if he actually caught up to us at any point. If he had genuinely retrieved whatever weapon he might have been reaching for in that glove compartment before we managed to escape. I quickly decided that our best chance of actually losing him was to try navigating toward my own neighborhood, an area I knew intimately from years of living there, familiar with every turn and side street in a way that gave us a genuine tactical advantage over someone who presumably had no idea where he was driving beyond simply following our taillights. I reasoned that if we could gain enough distance ahead of him, even briefly, we might be able to duck into a cul-de-sac or side street quickly enough that he would simply drive past without ever spotting exactly where we had disappeared to, and I explained this plan quickly to my friend between panicked breaths, directing him toward the familiar turns that would eventually lead us home. Sure enough, he continued following us the entire way, staying dangerously close behind as my friend pushed our car faster than either of us had ever driven together before, weaving through the familiar streets leading toward my neighborhood with a kind of desperate urgency that made every turn feel like it carried genuinely life or death stakes. My hands remained braced against the dashboard the entire time, my eyes darting constantly between the road ahead and the rearview mirror, watching that green truck's headlights stay locked onto us no matter how sharply my friend cut each turn. As we finally pulled into my neighborhood itself, I told my friend to accelerate hard and pull a sharp left into one of the smaller subdivisions branching off from the main road, a maneuver we executed almost perfectly despite both of us shaking with adrenaline and fear, the tires briefly squealing against the pavement as we made the turn. It worked. We sped down through the winding subdivision streets until we found a busy-looking cul-de-sac filled with several parked cars along the curb and quickly pulled in behind one particular vehicle sitting in someone's driveway, positioning our car in a way that would hopefully render us essentially invisible to anyone simply driving past on the main road without specifically searching each individual side street. We killed the engine and sat there in tense silence, ducked down slightly in our seats, barely daring to breathe, watching the entrance to that cul-de-sac with absolute terrified focus, our ears straining for any sound of an approaching engine that might indicate he had somehow figured out exactly where we had gone. After what felt like an agonizingly long stretch of tense, silent waiting, though it was probably only a minute or two in actual time, we saw the green truck drive past on the main road directly adjacent to the street where we had chosen to hide, continuing on without any indication whatsoever that he had noticed exactly where we had turned off. I remember watching that truck's shape pass through the narrow gap between two houses at the entrance to our hiding spot, my entire body frozen in place, waiting to see whether it would suddenly slow down or turn in our direction. It didn't. It simply continued on down the main road and disappeared from view, and I have never in my life experienced such an immediate, overwhelming wave of pure relief as I did in that exact moment, watching that truck continue past our hiding spot without slowing down or turning to investigate further. We stayed parked there for several additional minutes after that, neither of us quite ready to trust that the danger had truly passed, both of us scanning the street repeatedly for any sign that he might circle back around once he realized he had lost us. Once we felt reasonably confident he was actually gone, we allowed ourselves to finally exhale properly. And at that point, we tried, somewhat nervously, to start laughing about the whole ordeal, the way teenagers sometimes do when processing genuine fear, using humor as a way to release some of the tension still coursing through both our bodies, our laughter carrying that particular shaky, slightly hysterical quality that comes right after a genuine brush with real danger. But underneath that nervous laughter, both of us understood, without needing to say it out loud, just how differently that entire situation could have unfolded. We had no idea what exactly that man's intentions actually were, whether he genuinely had a weapon in that glove compartment, whether he had simply been engaging in some elaborate, disturbing form of intimidation, or whether we had narrowly escaped something considerably more dangerous than either of us wanted to fully contemplate in that moment. We ended up deciding, after talking it over briefly, that calling the police was the responsible thing to do, both to report the incident properly and to make sure we could actually get the rest of the way home safely without risking encountering that same truck again somewhere along our route. My hands were still trembling slightly as I dialed, my voice catching a bit as I tried to explain to the dispatcher exactly what had happened in a clear, coherent way, despite the adrenaline still coursing through my system. We called and explained what had happened as clearly and calmly as we could manage, given how shaken we both still were, and arranged to meet with a responding officer nearby so we could give a full statement and confirm we had a safe escort for the remainder of our drive home. The officer who met with us was patient and thorough, asking detailed questions about the truck's appearance, the driver's description, the specific sequence of events leading up to the confrontation at that second red light. He wrote everything down carefully in his notebook, occasionally glancing up at us with an expression that suggested he took our account seriously rather than dismissing it as typical teenage exaggeration, which offered its own small measure of comfort during an already deeply unsettling afternoon. We did our best to recall every detail accurately, still processing the adrenaline crash that inevitably follows an experience like that, our hands still slightly unsteady as we recounted everything that had happened over the course of just a few terrifying minutes, occasionally interrupting each other to add details the other had forgotten or hadn't fully registered in the moment. The officer explained that, unfortunately, without a license plate number or any additional identifying information beyond a general description of the truck and driver, there wasn't much more he could actively do beyond filing the report and keeping an eye out in the area for the remainder of his shift. Still, he was kind enough to follow us partway home in his patrol car, a gesture that meant more to both of us in that moment than I think he probably realized, offering exactly the kind of reassurance we desperately needed after everything we had just been through. We never saw that man or his green pickup truck again, not that day, not in the weeks and months that followed, not ever again as far as either of us knows to this day. And part of me has always wondered whether he simply moved away from the area entirely, or whether our paths genuinely just never happened to cross again by pure chance. I have often wondered, in the years since, exactly what could have driven a grown man to react with such disproportionate, frightening aggression over something as minor and commonplace as a teenager's tires briefly peeling out at a green light, an action so trivial and so common on ordinary roads that it hardly seemed worth any reaction at all under normal circumstances, let alone the kind of unhinged, escalating hostility we witnessed that afternoon. It felt, even at the time, like witnessing someone whose anger and instability ran far deeper than anything our small, thoughtless action could reasonably explain. Someone who was clearly already carrying some kind of significant personal crisis that our minor traffic mistake simply happened to trigger at exactly the wrong moment, in exactly the wrong place, on exactly the wrong afternoon of what had otherwise been an entirely unremarkable day for two ordinary teenagers. That specific gesture, the mimed gun pointed first at us and then turned against his own head, has never fully left my memory, resurfacing occasionally at unexpected moments, even years later. Whenever I happen to find myself sitting at a red light next to an unfamiliar vehicle, or whenever another driver's behavior on the road strikes me as even slightly aggressive or unpredictable, a small flash of remembered fear that surfaces and fades again almost as quickly as it arrives. There was something about the specific combination of that gesture's aimed threat and its self-directed conclusion that has always struck me as particularly disturbing, suggesting a level of genuine crisis and instability far beyond ordinary road rage, something that has made me wonder, more than once over the years, whether that man might have been dealing with some kind of serious personal struggle that had nothing directly to do with us at all, with our car simply becoming an unfortunate, random target for whatever pain or anger he was already carrying that particular afternoon. I have found myself over the years feeling a strange, complicated mixture of lingering fear and unexpected sympathy whenever I think back on that specific detail, wondering what state a person needs to be in to react that way toward two strangers over something so minor, and what might have happened to him in the time since that particular encounter. Questions I know I will probably never actually have answered. I have thought many times since about how differently that entire encounter could have ended, about the various darker possibilities that existed just beneath the surface of what actually happened. Possibilities I generally try not to dwell on too heavily, but that nonetheless surface unbidden every so often when this particular memory resurfaces. If my friend hadn't reacted quickly enough at that second light, if we hadn't managed to gain sufficient distance during our escape, if I hadn't happened to know that particular neighborhood well enough to navigate it successfully under such intense pressure, the outcome could have looked drastically different. There were so many small variables that had to align correctly for us to escape that situation unharmed. So many moments where a slightly slower reaction or a slightly less familiar neighborhood could have changed everything about how that afternoon ultimately concluded. It is a sobering thought, one that has occasionally kept me awake at night in the years since, contemplating just how much depended on a combination of quick thinking, familiar terrain, and simple, fortunate timing. Elements that felt entirely within our control in the moment, but that, looking back now, feel considerably more precarious and uncertain than they did while we were actually living through them. My friend and I have talked about that afternoon many times over the years since it happened. Even now, as adults with our own separate lives and responsibilities pulling us in different directions, our friendship having survived and even deepened through countless other shared experiences since that particular day. It remains one of those shared experiences that permanently bonds two people together. A genuine brush with something dangerous and unpredictable that we managed to escape from largely through quick thinking and a healthy dose of pure luck. We still occasionally bring it up when reminiscing about our shared high school years, always circling back to that same lingering question neither of us has ever been able to answer with any real confidence, wondering exactly what that man's actual intentions were, wondering what might have happened if that reach toward his glove compartment had actually produced whatever he had been reaching for before the light turned green and gave us our narrow window of escape. Every time we revisit the story, we seem to notice some small additional detail neither of us had previously mentioned, some fragment of memory that surfaces unexpectedly during the retelling, as though the full weight of that afternoon's events continues slowly revealing itself even all these years later. I don't drive through that particular intersection very often anymore, having moved away from that area years ago. But on the rare occasions when I do find myself passing through it, I always feel a small, involuntary tightening in my chest, a brief resurgence of that old fear settling momentarily into my body before rational thought reasserts itself and reminds me that the danger passed long ago, that we made it home safely that particular afternoon, and that whatever crisis or anger that man was carrying with him that day never actually caught up with us in the end. Still, the memory remains vivid, a genuine reminder of how quickly an entirely ordinary drive home from school can transform, without any real warning, into something considerably more frightening and unpredictable than either of us could have possibly anticipated when we first pulled up to that innocuous red light on what had otherwise been a completely unremarkable afternoon. Looking back now, with the added perspective that comes from years of additional life experience, I find myself thinking less about the specific fear of that afternoon and more about the broader lesson it taught me regarding just how quickly ordinary situations can shift into something genuinely dangerous, often triggered by circumstances entirely beyond your own control or understanding. Circumstances that have nothing to do with anything you yourself said or did beyond the smallest, most innocent of triggers. I have carried a certain heightened awareness with me ever since, a small, persistent habit of paying closer attention to other drivers' behavior, of trusting my instincts more readily whenever a situation on the road starts to feel even slightly off. A habit born directly from that one specific, terrifying afternoon so many years ago. I have also come to appreciate, in the years since, just how important it was that we both trusted our instincts completely in that moment, never hesitating or second-guessing our decision to run rather than engage further with someone whose behavior had already crossed so clearly into genuinely threatening territory. There is sometimes a temptation, especially as a teenager still learning to navigate difficult social situations, to try smoothing things over, to try appearing calm and reasonable in hopes that a hostile stranger might simply calm down in response, to avoid conflict rather than confront it head-on, even when confrontation might genuinely be the wiser, safer path. In this particular case, though, both my friend and I recognized almost immediately that engagement was not the right approach, that our only reasonable option was immediate, complete escape. And I remain genuinely grateful, even now, that neither of us hesitated or second-guessed that instinct in the critical moments when it actually mattered most. The whole experience has also left me with a lasting appreciation for the specific value of familiar territory during moments of genuine crisis. I have thought many times since about how differently things might have unfolded if that entire chase had taken place somewhere unfamiliar to both of us, some part of town neither my friend nor I actually knew well enough to navigate confidently under such intense pressure. Having that specific knowledge of my own neighborhood, every side street and cul-de-sac committed to memory through years of simply living there, turned out to be the single most important factor in our successful escape. More valuable in that moment than any amount of raw driving skill or vehicle performance could have been on its own. In the days following that incident, I remember feeling a strange, lingering unease every time I got into a car, a heightened alertness that took several weeks to fully fade back into the ordinary, unthinking comfort I had previously felt about something as routine as driving home from school. My friend mentioned experiencing something similar during that same period, both of us quietly processing the experience in our own separate ways, even as we continued going through the motions of ordinary teenage life, attending classes, seeing other friends, pretending on the surface that everything had simply returned to normal, even though something fundamental in how we both approached driving, and strangers on the road more generally, had shifted permanently as a result of that single, terrifying afternoon. I have also wondered over the years whether that man ever thought back on that encounter himself, whether he ever felt any sense of regret or reflection about how he had behaved toward two teenagers who had genuinely done nothing to deserve the level of aggression and threat he directed toward us. Part of me hopes that whatever crisis he was clearly experiencing that day eventually resolved itself in some positive way, that he found whatever help or support he might have needed. Though another part of me recognizes that I will likely never know anything more about what happened to him after that afternoon, that this entire encounter will simply remain forever an isolated, unresolved fragment of my own personal history, disconnected from whatever the rest of his story turned out to be. Even now, so many years removed from that particular afternoon, I still find myself occasionally checking my rearview mirror a beat longer than strictly necessary whenever I notice another vehicle following somewhat closely behind me. A small, lingering habit that traces its origin directly back to those terrifying few minutes spent fleeing down unfamiliar and then increasingly familiar streets, desperately trying to put enough distance between ourselves and a stranger whose intentions we never fully understood and, thankfully, never had to discover firsthand. That afternoon remains, all these years later, one of the clearest and most vivid memories of my entire adolescence, a stark reminder of just how quickly the ordinary can give way to something genuinely frightening, and of how much simple luck and quick thinking can matter when everything suddenly goes wrong on what had otherwise promised to be nothing more than an unremarkable drive home from school. I used to work as a cleaner at my school after classes ended for the day, staying behind for an hour or so, most afternoons, to help tidy up the empty classrooms once everyone else had already gone home, wiping down whiteboards, stacking chairs, sweeping up whatever mess had accumulated throughout the school day. It was a small, unremarkable part-time job that most of my classmates thought was slightly odd for someone my age to take on, but I liked the quiet routine of it, the simple satisfaction of leaving each classroom looking properly tidy before locking up for the evening. By the time I actually finished and left the building myself, the streets around the school were almost completely quiet, most students and staff long since having made their way home, leaving me to walk back alone through streets that had already emptied out for the evening. The usual after-school bustle of chatting students and passing cars having faded away entirely by the time I stepped outside. One particular afternoon, as I made my way home along my usual route, I noticed a man walking behind me. He wasn't walking especially close, keeping a fairly consistent distance the entire time, but there was something about his presence that felt obviously deliberate rather than coincidental. Something that made it clear, even from that first encounter, that he was specifically following my particular path rather than simply happening to walk in the same general direction. He struck me as genuinely unsettling to look at, his face carrying an odd, unnatural quality, almost as though it had been made of plastic rather than actual skin, smooth and strangely rigid in a way that made his features difficult to read properly. None of the ordinary small movements and expressions that typically animate a human face ever seeming to disturb that fixed, waxy surface. A stillness that felt profoundly wrong the longer I found myself looking at it. He wore a subtle, barely there smile the entire time, an expression that never seemed to shift or change regardless of anything happening around him, fixed permanently in place in a way that felt deeply wrong rather than friendly or reassuring. The kind of expression that gave the unsettling impression of a mask rather than a genuine human face. The first time I noticed him, I honestly didn't think much of it beyond a brief flicker of unease. Strange-looking strangers exist everywhere. And at 16 years old, walking home through an unremarkable suburban neighborhood, I didn't have any particular reason to assume the worst about a single, isolated encounter with someone who happened to be walking in roughly the same direction as me on one particular afternoon. I remember consciously telling myself that plenty of people have unusual faces or peculiar walks without there being anything genuinely sinister behind it. That judging a stranger too harshly based on appearance alone felt unfair and unnecessarily paranoid for something as ordinary as walking down a public street. I filed the memory away and continued on with my day, not giving it any further conscious thought, my 16-year-old mind quickly moving on to whatever more immediately pressing concerns typically occupied my attention at that age. About 2 weeks passed before I noticed him again. This second sighting struck me as considerably more unsettling than the first, given how much time had elapsed in between. The coincidence feeling far less easily dismissible than it had the first time around, that initial small flicker of unease sharpening suddenly into something closer to genuine concern. And from that particular day onward, I began seeing him consistently, every single day, walking behind me at that same careful, deliberate distance as I made my way home from school after finishing my cleaning duties. The consistency of it, the sheer reliability of his presence appearing behind me on that same stretch of road every single afternoon, gradually built into a persistent, low-grade dread that I carried with me throughout each day, wondering whether that particular afternoon would be the one where he finally appeared again, my stomach tightening with dread every single time I finished locking up the classrooms and stepped back outside into the empty street. I never told anyone about him. Not my parents, not my friends, not any of the teachers or staff members I worked alongside during my after-school cleaning shifts, keeping the entire situation locked tightly inside myself for weeks on end. At 16, I understood exactly what would happen if I mentioned any of this to my parents. They would immediately insist on driving me to and from school every single day going forward, a level of parental oversight that felt, at that particular age, deeply embarrassing and socially unacceptable. The kind of arrangement that would have marked me as somehow different or incapable in front of my peers. So instead, I simply kept quiet, carrying that growing unease privately, telling myself repeatedly that he was probably harmless, that plenty of strange-looking people exist in the world without actually posing any genuine threat, that I was likely overreacting to something ultimately innocent and explainable, a set of comforting rationalizations I repeated to myself almost daily, even as the pattern of his appearances continued unbroken week after week. One particular weekend, I was walking to a friend's house along a route that overlapped significantly with my usual path home from school, sharing several of the same streets before eventually branching off in a different direction toward her neighborhood instead of my own. As I turned onto the main road, the same specific stretch where I would typically first notice him trailing behind me during my weekday walks home, I happened to glance over toward a minibus parked at the bottom of that road. An ordinary-looking vehicle that I had genuinely never paid any particular attention to before that specific moment, tucked in among several other parked cars along that stretch of curb. And there he was, sitting directly in the driver's seat, staring out through the windshield directly at me, that same unsettling plastic-looking smile fixed firmly in place exactly as I remembered it from every previous encounter. His eyes tracking my movement with an intensity that made my skin crawl the instant our gazes met through the glass. I felt my entire body go cold in that instant, a wave of genuine, immediate fear replacing whatever mild unease I had previously carried about him. This was no longer simply a matter of an odd stranger who happened to walk in the same general direction as me during weekday afternoons. This was clear, undeniable evidence that he specifically knew my regular route, had apparently positioned himself deliberately along it, even on a weekend when I had no scheduled reason to be walking that particular stretch of road at all, meaning he must have been watching closely enough to know my habits extended beyond simply weekday school hours. I immediately called my friend, making sure to hold the phone visibly up to my ear and speak into it clearly, hoping that the obvious appearance of being on a call with someone might act as some kind of deterrent, might signal to him that I had immediate access to help if something were to happen. I remember trying to keep my voice steady as I explained the situation to her, walking briskly while attempting to sound as normal and unhurried as possible for anyone who might have been watching. even as my heart pounded violently beneath my ribs and every instinct screamed at me to simply run. But when I next glanced backward to check on my surroundings, he was there, standing only about 2 meters behind me, considerably closer than he had ever positioned himself during any of our previous encounters. That same fixed, unsettling smile stretched across his strange, plastic-looking face. I broke into something between a fast walk and an outright run, my heart pounding violently in my chest, and to my absolute horror, I could actually hear him doing exactly the same thing behind me, matching my pace and maintaining that same close distance, no matter how quickly I moved. His footsteps striking the pavement in perfect, unnerving rhythm with my own increasingly desperate strides, a sound that has never fully left my memory in all the years since. I remained on the phone with my friend the entire time, my voice shaking as I explained what was happening. And I told her urgently to open her front door and wait for me there, desperate to reach some kind of safety before he could close the remaining distance between us. Every second feeling impossibly long as I pushed myself to move faster while somehow still keeping enough breath to speak coherently into the phone. When I finally reached her house, I ran straight through the front door the moment she pulled it open, and together we immediately locked it behind us, both of us breathing hard, both of us genuinely terrified by what had just unfolded. My legs were shaking so badly I could hardly stand upright, and my friend guided me to sit down at her kitchen table while she peered cautiously through the window blinds to check whether he was actually still out there. From inside her house, we watched through the window as that man simply stood outside on the pavement directly in front of her home, unmoving, that same disturbing smile still fixed on his face, staring directly at the window where we stood watching him, his posture perfectly still in a way that felt somehow even more unnerving than if he had been pacing back and forth or showing any sign of ordinary restlessness. He remained there for approximately 2 full hours, never approaching any closer, never attempting to knock or make any additional contact, simply standing perfectly still and smiling, staring intently at the house the entire time, that fixed expression never once wavering despite the passing time. Those 2 hours felt endless, my friend and I taking turns watching him through a small gap in the blinds, neither of us willing to fully step away from the window in case he attempted something the moment we stopped watching. Each of us trading off the watch as though standing guard against something we didn't fully understand, but knew instinctively needed to be monitored closely. Her parents were both out running errands that afternoon, leaving just the 2 of us alone in the house, with him standing sentinel outside, and I remember the particular quality of silence that settled over the house during that stretch of time. Both of us speaking only in hushed whispers, as though somehow he might hear us through the walls if we spoke at a normal volume. We debated more than once whether we should call the police, but something about the situation, perhaps simple teenage indecision combined with genuine uncertainty about what exactly we would even report beyond a man standing on a public street, kept us hesitating throughout those 2 hours rather than actually picking up the phone. Eventually, after those 2 agonizing hours had finally passed, he was gone, vanishing as suddenly and inexplicably as he had first appeared in my life weeks earlier. One moment my friend glanced through the blinds and reported he was still standing there exactly as before, and the next time either of us checked, perhaps 15 or 20 minutes later, the pavement outside was completely empty. No sign of him anywhere along the street in either direction. I never saw him again after that particular weekend, not during my remaining walks home from school, not anywhere else around the neighborhood, not at any point during the rest of the time I continued living in that area before eventually moving away for other reasons entirely unrelated to this experience. I have thought about that entire ordeal many times over the years since it happened, turning over every detail in my memory, trying to understand exactly what his intentions might have been, why he had apparently selected me specifically to follow with such consistent, deliberate patience over the course of several weeks. Was it something specific about my regular schedule that made me an easy, predictable target? The fact that I consistently left school later than most other students due to my cleaning job, walking home alone through increasingly quiet streets while everyone else had already dispersed hours earlier? Or was it simply random chance? Some unfortunate coincidence of timing and location that placed me in his path on that first afternoon and somehow led to weeks of continued deliberate pursuit afterward? I have never found any satisfying answer to those questions, and the not knowing has always been, in some ways, almost as unsettling as the original experience itself. There is something particularly disturbing about never understanding the full scope of a threat you managed to escape, about carrying forward an unresolved mystery regarding exactly how much danger you were actually in, and exactly what might have happened if certain small circumstances, my quick phone call, my friend's readiness to open her door immediately, had played out even slightly differently. I eventually moved away from that particular town for reasons entirely separate from this experience, building a new life elsewhere, generally managing to leave most of the specific anxiety surrounding that encounter behind me as the years gradually passed. The memories softening slightly with distance and time, the way most difficult memories eventually do. But last weekend, I went back to visit my parents, who still live in that same house, in that same neighborhood where all of this originally took place all those years ago. It was meant to be an entirely ordinary visit, nothing more than a routine catch-up over a weekend, the kind of trip home I had made many times before without incident. And as I drove along that same main road, the same stretch where I had first spotted him sitting in that parked minibus all those years earlier, I happened to glance toward that exact same spot at the bottom of the road. Some old, half-forgotten instinct drawing my attention there almost automatically as I approached that particular stretch of street. An instinct I hadn't even consciously registered until my eyes had already fixed on that specific location. The minibus was still there, parked in precisely the same location it had occupied all those years earlier, as though no time whatsoever had passed since that terrifying weekend afternoon when I had first noticed him sitting inside it, watching me approach with that same unsettling, unchanging smile. My hands tightened involuntarily on the steering wheel the moment I recognized it, my whole body flooding with a rush of old, familiar fear that I hadn't expected to feel with such sudden, overwhelming intensity after so many years of distance from the original experience. I don't know if that specific detail should actually mean anything significant. Whether a parked vehicle simply remaining in the same general area over the course of several years is genuinely notable, or simply an unremarkable coincidence. The kind of thing that happens naturally in quiet residential neighborhoods where certain vehicles sometimes sit unused or rarely moved for extended periods without any sinister explanation whatsoever. Logically, I understand that minibuses and other vehicles sometimes remain parked in the same spot for years at a time, particularly in quiet residential areas where street parking goes largely unmonitored and unchallenged, where a vehicle belonging to someone who has since moved away, or who simply no longer uses it regularly, might realistically sit undisturbed for far longer than anyone would normally expect. There could easily be a perfectly mundane explanation behind its continued presence there. Some ordinary story involving an elderly owner who no longer drives, or a vehicle simply abandoned by someone who moved away without bothering to have it towed or sold. And yet, seeing it there again in that exact same spot immediately brought back every single detail of that terrifying afternoon with a vividness that genuinely caught me off guard, my whole body tensing instinctively the moment I recognized it. Every physical sensation of that original fear rushing back as though barely any time had passed at all since that particular weekend. I didn't stop to investigate further. I didn't slow down or linger anywhere near that particular stretch of road any longer than absolutely necessary to safely continue on my way toward my parents' house, my foot pressing slightly harder on the accelerator almost without conscious thought as I passed that spot. Some old, deeply ingrained instinct urging me forward without hesitation. Some part of me, even now as a fully grown adult with years of distance from that original experience, simply didn't want to risk finding out whether he might still somehow be connected to that vehicle in any way. Didn't want to test whether that same unsettling presence from my childhood might still be lingering somewhere nearby, waiting patiently the way he apparently always had, for another unsuspecting person to notice him watching from behind that windshield. I mentioned it briefly to my mother later that evening, almost in passing, asking whether she knew anything about who owned that particular minibus or why it had remained parked in that same spot for so many years. She simply shrugged, saying she had honestly never paid it much attention, that it had simply become part of the ordinary background scenery of the street over time, the kind of fixture you eventually stop consciously registering after seeing it in the same place often enough. I have told a few close friends about this experience over the years, and the reaction is almost always the same immediate horror mixed with disbelief, followed by the same inevitable question about whether I ever reported him to the police, whether any kind of official record exists documenting what happened during those weeks when he consistently followed me home from school. Honestly, at 16, reporting it to any kind of authority never seriously crossed my mind. Not with the same urgency it probably should have. I was far too focused on avoiding the parental oversight I feared would follow any admission of what was actually happening. Too young and inexperienced to fully understand the gravity of what I was actually dealing with. Too caught up in typical teenage concerns about independence, and appearing capable to recognize that this situation genuinely warranted serious adult intervention, regardless of any resulting inconvenience to my daily routine. Looking back, I recognize just how much that particular teenage mindset, that specific desperation to avoid seeming vulnerable or dependent in front of my peers, actually worked directly against my own safety during those weeks, keeping me silent about something that should have been reported and addressed properly from the very first sighting. Some of my closer friends, upon hearing this story for the first time, have asked whether I ever considered the possibility that he might have specifically targeted me because of my after-school job. Because my particular schedule made me predictably alone on those quiet streets, in a way that other students, walking home in larger groups earlier in the afternoon, simply weren't. That specific theory has occurred to me many times over the years myself, and it remains one of the more plausible explanations I have managed to construct, even without any way of actually confirming it. There was something specifically convenient about my situation for someone with predatory intentions, a lone teenager walking the exact same route at the exact same time every single weekday afternoon. A kind of predictable pattern that would have made careful, patient observation and eventual pursuit considerably easier than targeting someone with a less consistent schedule. Someone whose comings and goings would have been far harder to track and anticipate with any real reliability. Looking back now, as an adult with considerably more life experience and perspective than I possessed at 16, I recognize clearly just how dangerous that entire situation actually was, and I feel a distinct kind of retrospective fear that I never allowed myself to fully experience at the time. Too busy managing the immediate, day-to-day reality of avoiding him to properly process the larger picture of what those weeks of being followed and watched actually represented. A stranger with an unsettling, unnatural appearance had apparently selected me specifically, had studied my routine closely enough to know precisely where and when to position himself, had escalated from simply following me at a distance to actively pursuing me at close range the moment he found an opportunity when I was walking somewhere slightly outside my normal, predictable pattern. That escalation, in particular, strikes me now as the most genuinely alarming detail of the entire experience. The clear evidence that whatever restraint he had shown during those weeks of merely following me was not born out of any lack of intent, but simply out of patience. A willingness to wait for precisely the right opportunity before finally attempting to close the distance between us. A level of calculated patience that feels, in hindsight, considerably more chilling than any sudden, impulsive act of aggression might have been. I don't know what would have happened if my friend hadn't been home that particular weekend, if she hadn't been able to open her door immediately the moment I called out for help, if I had needed those extra crucial seconds to find safety somewhere else entirely. I try not to dwell too heavily on those darker hypothetical possibilities, but they surface occasionally nonetheless, particularly whenever this specific memory resurfaces unprompted, triggered by something as simple and mundane as spotting an old, familiar minibus still parked in exactly the same spot it had occupied years earlier, waiting there silently as though nothing at all had changed in all the time that had passed since that particular terrifying afternoon. I have also thought, more than once over the years, about how differently I might handle a similar situation now, as an adult, compared to how I actually handled it as a frightened 16-year-old, more concerned with appearing independent than with my own genuine safety. I like to believe I would report something like this immediately now, would tell someone the very first time a stranger's presence felt deliberately, persistently wrong, rather than allowing weeks to pass in uncomfortable silence out of fear of parental restrictions, choosing my own actual safety over any concern about how it might look to friends or classmates. That particular lesson, learned in the hardest and most frightening way possible, has stayed with me ever since, shaping how I now respond to any situation that triggers even a small fraction of that same instinctive unease, whether it involves my own safety or the safety of someone else I care about. A heightened sensitivity to genuine danger that I doubt will ever fully fade, regardless of how. Many years continue passing without incident. I sometimes wonder, too, whether that minibus sitting there still, unchanged after all these years, is simply an unremarkable coincidence I have chosen to imbue with far more significance than it actually deserves. My own lingering trauma projecting meaning onto something that is, in reality, nothing more than an old, forgotten vehicle nobody has bothered to move. But another part of me, the same part that instinctively pressed harder on the accelerator without conscious thought the moment I recognized it, remains genuinely unable to fully dismiss the possibility that something more significant lingers behind that particular detail. Some unresolved thread connecting my 16-year-old self's terrifying weekend to whatever remains sitting quietly in that same spot to this very day, waiting, perhaps, for nothing more sinister than eventual removal by whoever technically owns it, or perhaps for something I would honestly rather not spend too much time imagining in any real detail. My grandfather ran a company involved in timber and mining, and as part of expanding the business, he needed to set up a small office in a fairly remote part of a developing country. The kind of place far enough removed from any major city that basic infrastructure like reliable power and communication could sometimes be unpredictable. The company had been eyeing expansion into that particular region for some time, drawn by the abundant natural resources available there and the relatively favorable business conditions the local government offered to foreign companies willing to invest in developing that specific area of the country. While scouting locations for this new office, he found a house available for an incredibly cheap price. Cheap even by the already modest standards of that particular region, the kind of deal that should have immediately raised suspicion given how significantly below market value it was being offered, especially considering the property itself was reasonably sized and appeared, at least outwardly, to be in decent structural condition. Obviously, there was a catch. When the local villagers learned that my grandfather was considering purchasing this particular property, several of them approached him directly, warning him strongly against buying it. They explained that the house was widely believed to be haunted, and that every single person who had ever lived there throughout its history had died violently at some point during their residence. Some of the older villagers apparently offered specific accounts of previous tragedies connected to the house, stretching back multiple generations, though my grandfather, hearing these stories secondhand through a translator, never took the time to seriously investigate or verify any of the specific historical claims being made. My grandfather, being a practical businessman with little patience for what he considered old superstitions, dismissed their warnings entirely, viewing the whole story as nothing more than local folklore that had somehow attached itself to an otherwise unremarkable property, probably explaining why it had sat unsold and available at such a dramatically reduced price for as long as it apparently had. He purchased the house anyway, planning to use the arrangement in a practical, efficient way. The employee assigned to establish and manage this new remote office would live on the upper floor of the house along with his family, while the lower floor would be converted into the actual office space for conducting business, an arrangement that made logical sense from a purely operational standpoint, minimizing overhead costs by combining living quarters and workspace within a single property. This particular employee moved in with his wife and their 3 children, settling into what was supposed to be a fairly standard, if somewhat remote, work assignment for however long it took to get the new office properly established and operational. My grandfather has mentioned that this particular employee had actually seemed genuinely enthusiastic about the assignment initially, viewing it as a valuable opportunity to demonstrate his capabilities and advance his career within the company. An enthusiasm that made the eventual outcome all the more difficult for my grandfather to fully reconcile in his own mind afterward. For a while, everything seemed to proceed normally. The employees sent periodic updates about the office setup progress, mentioned settling his family into their new home, and generally reported nothing out of the ordinary during those initial weeks and months following their relocation. But then my grandfather suddenly stopped receiving any communication from this employee. No updates, no reports, nothing at all for an extended stretch of time that eventually grew concerning enough to prompt action. Given how remote the location actually was, and how unreliable infrastructure like phone lines and electricity could sometimes be in that particular region, my grandfather initially wasn't overly concerned, assuming there had simply been some kind of power outage or communication disruption, the sort of ordinary inconvenience that happened periodically in areas that far removed from more developed infrastructure. He had experienced similar communication gaps with other remote operations before, situations that always eventually resolved themselves once local infrastructure issues were addressed. So this particular silence didn't immediately strike him as anything unusual or alarming, at least not during those first several days of unexpected quiet from that particular posting. Eventually, though, as the silence stretched on for far longer than any reasonable outage would typically last, well beyond the time frame that previous communication disruptions with other remote sites had ever lasted, my grandfather grew concerned enough to contact the local police, asking them to check on the employee directly since he had become completely unreachable through any available means of communication. He remembers feeling a growing unease as the days passed, without any response, eventually deciding that simply waiting any longer wasn't a responsible option, regardless of how ordinary these kinds of communication gaps had previously proven to be in that particular region. A decision he has since described as one of the harder professional judgment calls of his entire career. What the police found when they finally arrived at the house was horrific beyond anything anyone could have reasonably anticipated. Every single member of that family was dead. According to what investigators pieced together, the employee had killed his wife, his 3 children, and then finally himself, using a machete rather than any firearm. An especially brutal and deliberate method of violence that made the entire scene considerably more disturbing than a simpler explanation might have been. This wasn't a case of quiet, slow bleeding from cut wrists, or anything resembling a controlled, deliberate method of self-harm. Every single victim, including the man himself, had been hacked. The violence clearly extensive and prolonged, rather than quick or merciful in any sense, requiring, by any reasonable estimation, a considerable amount of time and sustained physical effort to inflict that level of damage across 5 separate people. My grandfather received this news through a somewhat garbled, second-hand phone call from the local police captain, a conversation conducted partly through a translator given the significant language barrier involved. And he has described that particular moment many times over the years as one of the most disorienting and difficult experiences of his entire professional career, one he still finds genuinely difficult to discuss in full detail even now. He had, after all, personally made the decision to purchase that property against explicit local warnings, and learning that an entire family, people he had personally hired and relocated there, had died in such an extreme and violent manner weighed on him heavily, regardless of how much he continued insisting, at least outwardly, that the supernatural warnings surrounding the house had nothing genuinely to do with what had actually happened. I want to be honest here about something important regarding the specific details that eventually circulated about that scene. By the time these stories reached me, filtered through multiple retellings and clearly influenced by shock, trauma, and probably a fair amount of understandable local superstition, certain elements had almost certainly become exaggerated or distorted beyond what could have been reliably or accurately witnessed by anyone actually present at the discovery. Finding 5 bodies in that condition, including 3 young children, would understandably be traumatic enough to make anyone's memory and perception genuinely unreliable afterward. A psychological reality that forensic experts and trauma researchers alike have documented extensively regarding witness reliability following extremely violent or shocking scenes. So I won't attempt to repeat every specific detail that eventually made its way back to my family, since I genuinely cannot separate what was actually confirmed from what had simply grown more elaborate and exaggerated with each subsequent retelling. I will say that once certain stories started involving phrases like a supposedly magic machete, I largely stopped taking the more elaborate details seriously at all, recognizing that particular threshold as roughly where credible information ended and pure local legend clearly began. What I was told, and what does seem to have been reasonably well corroborated across multiple accounts, was that the entire room where this occurred was extensively covered in blood, including, notably, the ceiling itself. Some of the locals interpreted this particular detail as further evidence of supernatural involvement, theorizing that malevolent spirits had somehow thrown the bodies around the room with enough force to spray blood that high, and in that particular pattern. This particular theory apparently gained significant traction among certain members of the local community, becoming almost a fixed, unquestioned part of how the story was retold and understood within that region afterward. repeated so consistently in later years that it eventually became functionally inseparable from the more verifiable facts of what had actually occurred that night. When I heard this theory repeated within my own family, I actually tried explaining the fairly straightforward physics involved. How arterial blood spray from certain types of severe trauma can absolutely reach ceiling height under specific, if admittedly gruesome, circumstances without requiring any supernatural explanation whatsoever. A phenomenon that, while genuinely disturbing to contemplate, is actually reasonably well documented within forensic literature regarding violent crime scenes involving this particular type of injury. This explanation was met with a considerable number of skeptical, slightly unsettled looks from various family members, most of whom seemed to prefer the more dramatic, supernatural explanation, regardless of the more mundane, if still deeply disturbing, physical explanation available, and I eventually gave up trying to convince anyone who had already firmly settled on the supernatural interpretation. Now, here is the detail that has always struck me as genuinely the strangest and most difficult to explain of the entire situation. Assuming everything else described so far wasn't already unsettling enough on its own. Apparently, the man had somehow managed to barricade the bedroom door using the bed itself, an enormous, extremely heavy, old-fashioned piece of furniture that would ordinarily require multiple people working together to move it even a short distance under normal circumstances. This was reportedly one of those large, solidly built wooden bed frames common in older homes throughout that region, constructed from dense, heavy timber, and designed to remain permanently in place rather than ever being moved once initially assembled within a room. And he had done this specifically with his wife, and children still on top of the bed at the time, using this massive piece of furniture to seal the room and prevent any possibility of escape before proceeding with whatever violence followed. A detail that suggests a genuinely disturbing level of premeditation and control over the situation, regardless of whatever psychological state he was actually experiencing in those final hours. The local villagers who discussed this particular detail with my grandfather and his associates viewed it as clear, undeniable evidence that the man had been possessed by malevolent spirits, arguing that no ordinary person could possibly move furniture of that size and weight single-handedly, especially not while simultaneously managing 3 frightened children and a wife who presumably would have been actively resisting whatever was happening. Their explanation was that only some kind of supernatural force, temporarily inhabiting and empowering the man's body, could account for that particular feat of physical strength occurring under those specific circumstances. Several villagers apparently referenced similar stories from local folklore describing other supposed instances throughout the region's history where individuals believed to be possessed had displayed comparably impossible feats of strength. Weaving this particular incident seamlessly into an already existing tradition of local supernatural belief that long predated my grandfather's arrival in that region entirely. I have always leaned toward a different explanation myself, one considerably more grounded in psychology than in anything supernatural. Isolation, particularly the kind of extreme, prolonged isolation that comes from relocating an entire family to an extremely remote location with limited outside contact or support, can genuinely destabilize a person's mental state in ways that are difficult for people who haven't experienced anything comparable to fully appreciate. A psychological strain that mental health professionals have increasingly documented as a genuine risk factor for various severe conditions among individuals and families relocated to isolated postings for work purposes. Living far from any established community, without the ordinary social support systems most people rely on, without ever consciously thinking about them, can place enormous psychological strain on individuals. particularly when combined with the additional pressure of managing an unfamiliar job responsibility in a foreign, unfamiliar environment. Add to that whatever additional psychological pressure might have come from local rumors about the house's violent history, rumors that presumably would have eventually reached the family, regardless of my grandfather's own skepticism about them, and you have circumstances that could plausibly explain a severe psychological break without needing to invoke anything supernatural whatsoever. And there is well-documented precedent, even in purely clinical medical literature, for individuals experiencing acute psychotic episodes or extreme adrenaline states to display genuinely remarkable, seemingly impossible feats of physical strength, the kind of adrenaline-fueled capability that occasionally allows people to lift objects or move furniture that would normally be far beyond their ordinary physical capacity, a phenomenon that has been documented in various medical case studies involving individuals under extreme psychological or physiological stress. In the aftermath of this horrific discovery, my grandfather found himself having to manage an entirely different kind of crisis, one considerably more practical and business-focused than anything related to the supernatural theories circulating among the local population. Given the remote location of the property and the general lack of consistent media infrastructure in that particular region, he was able to arrange a series of bribes, a fairly common and unfortunately necessary practice in certain parts of the world for handling exactly this kind of sensitive situation, ensuring that news of what had happened never reached any wider press coverage. He worked closely with a local business contact who had considerably more experience navigating exactly this kind of delicate situation, someone who apparently knew precisely which local officials needed to be approached and roughly what level of financial incentive would be required to ensure their cooperation with keeping the entire matter contained quietly and permanently. He also managed to arrange for local authorities to officially classify the deaths as natural causes, an explanation that, admittedly, strains credibility considerably once you actually consider what natural cause could possibly account for 5 separate deaths involving extensive machete wounds, but apparently sufficient bureaucratic flexibility existed in that particular region to make such an official classification possible, with the right combination of financial incentive and limited outside scrutiny. My grandfather has never fully explained, at least not to me directly, exactly how that particular bureaucratic sleight of hand was accomplished, though he has occasionally hinted that the specific wording used in the official documentation was carefully crafted to avoid any language that would obviously contradict the mundane classification, while still technically satisfying whatever minimal paperwork requirements local regulations demanded of him at the time. Every employee who became aware of the actual details surrounding this incident was required to sign a formal non-disclosure agreement, ensuring the situation remained thoroughly contained within a very small circle of people directly involved in managing its aftermath. My grandfather's primary concern throughout this entire process was protecting both the company's ongoing business interests in that particular region and, to whatever extent possible, sparing the broader public from unnecessary exposure to details that would serve no productive purpose being widely known. He has mentioned, in later conversations about this particular incident, that he genuinely believed at the time that suppressing the more sensational details was the responsible choice, both for protecting the company's reputation and for sparing the broader public from unnecessary exposure to details that would serve no productive purpose being widely known, though he has also acknowledged, with the benefit of considerable hindsight, that some of his reasoning at the time was likely more self-serving than he fully recognized in the moment, a realization that has apparently weighed on him more heavily as the years have passed. With that particular crisis, at least officially resolved on paper, my grandfather then faced the considerably more mundane, though still genuinely difficult, challenge of finding someone else willing to actually relocate to that same remote location and continue establishing the office that had originally been planned. Even though the specific, gorier details of what had actually happened remained protected under the various non-disclosure agreements he had put in place, word had still spread, in the vague, general way these things inevitably do, that the previous employee assigned to that particular posting had died there under mysterious and clearly troubling circumstances. Office gossip, regardless of how carefully management tries to control information flow, has a way of spreading even the most carefully guarded secrets in some diluted, distorted form. And this particular situation proved no exception, with rumors circulating throughout the company about a mysterious death connected to that remote posting, despite nobody officially confirming any specific details to anyone outside the small circle already involved. Unsurprisingly, given even this limited, filtered version of the story, absolutely no one within the company volunteered to take on that same assignment. My grandfather approached several different employees directly, initially trying a straightforward, honest appeal explaining the company's continued need to establish operations in that particular region, hoping that professional loyalty and career ambition might outweigh whatever vague unease people felt about the unclear circumstances surrounding the previous employee's death. Every single person he approached politely but firmly declined, several of them citing family obligations or personal preferences for staying closer to the main office, reasons that, while technically plausible on their own, seemed suspiciously convenient given how uniformly everyone suddenly found reasons to avoid that particular posting entirely. My grandfather eventually attempted a different approach, formally promoting one particular employee, providing him with an impressive-sounding new title, and informing him that he would now be responsible for establishing and running that particular remote office going forward, hoping that the combination of career advancement and increased authority might prove sufficiently persuasive where simple requests had already failed. That employee, rather than accepting what should have theoretically been viewed as a significant career advancement and promotion, simply quit the company entirely instead, apparently deciding that no title or salary increase was sufficient compensation for taking on a position so closely associated with what had happened to his predecessor. My grandfather has mentioned, somewhat ruefully, that this particular employee had actually been considered one of the company's more promising up-and-coming managers before this entire incident, someone whose sudden resignation represented a genuine loss for the organization beyond simply the immediate problem of staffing that particular remote posting. A loss that took the company considerable time to fully recover from in terms of management talent alone. I have thought about this entire story many times over the years since first hearing it from various family members, always struck by how many genuinely disturbing layers exist within it beyond even the most obvious, horrific violence at its core. There is the question of what actually happened inside that man's mind during whatever final breakdown led him to commit such extreme violence against his own family. A question that will likely remain permanently unanswered, given how thoroughly the official record of the incident was deliberately obscured. There is the question of how much of the supernatural interpretation that, developed afterward, reflects genuine, unexplainable phenomena versus simply the natural human tendency to reach for supernatural explanations when confronted with violence too extreme and too disturbing to easily processed through purely rational psychological frameworks alone. And there is the more mundane, though still genuinely unsettling, question of exactly how normalized certain practices, bribing local officials, silencing potential witnesses through legal agreements, classifying obviously violent deaths under deliberately misleading official causes, had apparently become within certain business operations conducted in particularly remote or under-resourced regions of the world, a normalcy that has always struck me as almost as disturbing in its own quiet way as the original violence itself. I never met the employee or his family myself, having only heard this entire story secondhand through various relatives discussing it in hushed, careful tones over the years, usually only when the conversation had already drifted toward other family business history, and this particular incident came up almost as an aside. An especially dark chapter that nonetheless remained part of my grandfather's broader business legacy. I don't know what actually drove that man to do what he apparently did. Whether it was genuine mental illness, exacerbated by extreme isolation, some kind of acute psychological break triggered by specific local circumstances, or, as many of the villagers who originally warned my grandfather against purchasing that property would likely insist even now, something considerably more difficult to explain through any purely rational psychological framework at all. What I do know is that the house itself, regardless of whatever actually caused that particular tragedy, has apparently continued carrying its unsettling reputation among local residents in that region ever since. The story of what happened there simply becoming one more addition to whatever collection of dark, unresolved stories already surrounded that particular property before my grandfather ever purchased it against the strong warnings of people who clearly understood something about that. Location that he, in his practical, business-minded skepticism, was simply unwilling to take seriously at the time. I don't know whether my grandfather's company ever successfully established a functioning office in that location, or whether the property itself was eventually abandoned entirely, its reputation having grown too dark and too well known locally for anyone to seriously consider living or working there again, regardless of whatever financial incentives might theoretically be offered. Some family stories, I have come to understand over the years, simply remain permanently unresolved, carrying forward through repeated tellings without ever reaching any kind of satisfying, definitive conclusion. And this particular story, as disturbing and strange as every single detail of it remains even now, has always struck me as exactly that particular kind of permanently unresolved family history. I have often wondered, too, about the specific psychology behind why this particular story continues to hold such a grip on my imagination even now, years after first hearing it. I think part of it comes from the sheer scale of the tragedy involved, the loss of 5 human lives, 3 of them children, condensed into what was apparently a single, brief, catastrophically violent episode. But I think an equally significant part comes from the unresolved nature of the explanation itself. The way this story sits, permanently suspended between 2 entirely different frameworks for understanding what happened. One grounded in psychology and isolation, the other grounded in generations of local supernatural belief about that specific piece of land. Neither explanation fully satisfies me on its own, and I suspect it never will, given how much crucial evidence and context was deliberately suppressed in the immediate aftermath, specifically to protect my grandfather's business interests. I have also thought, on occasion, about the specific villagers who originally warned my grandfather against purchasing that property in the first place, wondering whether any of them ever felt some grim sense of vindication once news of what had happened eventually reached them, filtered, as it inevitably was, through whatever limited channels remained open, despite my grandfather's efforts at containment. I imagine there must have been at least some quiet, unspoken satisfaction among those who had tried to warn him, tempered considerably, I would hope, by genuine grief over the fact that an entire innocent family had to die before their warnings were finally tragically validated in the most horrific way imaginable. Whether they viewed this validation as confirmation of genuine supernatural forces at work, or simply as confirmation of whatever specific historical pattern of tragedy had genuinely accumulated around that particular house over generations for entirely mundane reasons, I have no way of knowing. And I suspect that particular distinction likely mattered far less to them than the simple, devastating fact that their warnings had once again proven tragically accurate. Back when I was still in nursing school, many years ago now, something happened during one of my clinical rotations that I have never been able to fully explain, and honestly something I still think about regularly even now, after having worked as a nurse for over 20 years since. Nursing school clinical rotations are meant to expose students to as many different kinds of real hospital situations as possible before they graduate and step into the role full-time, and by the point this happened, I had already witnessed a fair number of difficult, emotional moments on the floor. Deaths among them, since that unfortunately comes with the territory of working in a hospital setting. Even so, in all that time, across every hospital unit I have worked in, and every strange or difficult situation I have witnessed in a career built around life and death moments, nothing has ever come close to matching what happened that particular day, and I doubt anything ever will. There was a patient on the unit where I was completing my clinical training, an older woman who had made her wishes about her own end-of-life care extremely clear, both to her medical team and to her own family, well before any of this took place. She did not want to be resuscitated under any circumstances, a wish she had apparently expressed repeatedly and firmly over the years, the kind of clear, unambiguous stance that hospital staff take seriously and document carefully specifically to prevent exactly the kind of situation that ended up unfolding, regardless of her clearly stated wishes. For those unfamiliar with how this works within a hospital setting, a patient's wishes about resuscitation are typically documented through what is called a code status, essentially a formal medical order that tells the entire care team exactly what to do, or specifically what not to do, if that patient's heart or breathing stops. A do not resuscitate order, commonly referred to simply as a DNR, means exactly what it sounds like. An explicit instruction that no attempts should be made to revive the patient through CPR, defibrillation, or any other emergency intervention if their heart stops beating or they stop breathing on their own. This particular patient had a clearly documented DNR in place, reflecting exactly what she herself had stated she wanted for her own care. As time went on during her hospital stay, her condition unfortunately began to decline in ways that eventually affected her mental clarity, reaching a point where she became what is medically referred to as altered, meaning she was no longer considered capable of making sound decisions about her own care or fully understanding the medical situation she was in. This kind of decline is unfortunately common enough in certain conditions and certain patient populations. And hospitals have established legal and medical procedures in place specifically for handling situations like this. Procedures designed to make sure decisions can still be made properly on a patient's behalf, even once they are no longer able to make those decisions clearly for themselves. In this particular case, once the patient had become altered and was no longer able to make her own medical decisions, her family stepped in and obtained power of attorney over her care, a legal designation that gave them the authority to make medical decisions on her behalf going forward. This is a completely normal, legally recognized process, one that exists specifically to handle situations exactly like this one, where a patient can no longer advocate for themselves and someone else needs to be legally empowered to make those decisions in their place. Under most circumstances, this system works exactly as intended, family members using their legal authority to make decisions that reflect what they genuinely believe their loved one would have wanted, based on everything they know about that person's values and previously expressed wishes. In this case, though, something happened that immediately struck everyone on the care team as troubling. Despite the patient having been extremely clear, on record, well before she ever became altered, that she did not want to be resuscitated under any circumstances, her family, now holding legal power of attorney over her medical decisions, chose to change her official code status from DNR to what is called full code, meaning the exact opposite of her previously stated wishes. An instruction that now told the medical team to use every possible intervention, including CPR and defibrillation, to try to revive her if her heart or breathing stopped. Several of the nurses who had cared for her before she became altered remembered her speaking about this directly, in plain, firm language, telling anyone who would listen that she had lived a long, full life and did not want machines or aggressive intervention keeping her alive past her natural time. Hearing that this had all been quietly reversed once she was no longer able to speak up for herself left a lot of the staff feeling uneasy long before anything else about that day went wrong. This decision troubled the entire nursing staff considerably, myself included, since we all understood clearly that this new instruction ran directly counter to what the patient herself had explicitly wanted before she lost the capacity to advocate for herself. But legally, once a family member holds power of attorney, their decisions about a patient's care generally have to be followed by the medical team, regardless of whether those decisions match what the patient had previously expressed wanting for themselves. It placed the entire staff in an incredibly difficult position, professionally and ethically bound to respect the family's legal authority, while personally knowing this was not what the patient herself had wanted for her own final moments. We all hoped, honestly, that this distressing situation would simply never come to matter in any real, immediate sense, that her condition would stabilize, or that if the worst did happen, it would happen peacefully, without requiring any of us to actually act on that newly changed code status. Unfortunately, that hope did not last. Not long after her code status had been officially changed, the patient's heart went into what is called ventricular fibrillation, commonly shortened to VFib, a dangerous and chaotic heart rhythm where the heart quivers uselessly instead of pumping blood properly, quickly leading to a complete loss of both pulse and breathing if not corrected immediately. Given her now official full code status, the nursing staff present had no choice but to immediately begin CPR, exactly the intervention that would never have been performed under her original DNR order, but which was now legally required given the family's decision to change her status. Chest compressions began right away, following standard emergency protocol, while someone called for the code team and the emergency crash cart to be brought immediately to her bedside. The code team and the crash cart arrived quickly, as they are trained and expected to do in exactly this kind of emergency situation, and the doctor leading the resuscitation effort prepared to use the defibrillator. The device specifically designed to deliver a controlled electrical shock to the heart in an attempt to correct a dangerous rhythm like VFib and restore a normal, functional heartbeat. This is one of the most standard, most reliable pieces of emergency equipment used in exactly this kind of situation, checked and tested regularly specifically to make sure it will function properly whenever it is actually needed in a real emergency. The doctor moved to deliver the shock, following the exact same procedure that had been performed successfully countless times before in similar emergencies throughout that hospital. But this time, the machine simply did not deliver the shock at all. He tried again, checking the connections, making sure everything was properly set up, and attempted a second time. Again, nothing happened. the machine failing to deliver the shock it was specifically designed and maintained to provide reliably in exactly this kind of critical, time-sensitive emergency. This continued for several more attempts. The doctor and the rest of the code team trying repeatedly to get the defibrillator to function properly, growing increasingly confused and frustrated as machine after attempted use failed to deliver any shock at all, despite the device appearing, by every outward indication, to be working normally, powered on, properly connected, showing no obvious error messages or malfunction indicators that would explain why it simply would not deliver the shock it was supposed to provide. CPR continued throughout this entire time, the nursing staff maintaining chest compressions as best they could, while the doctor kept attempting, again and again, to get the defibrillator working. Every single attempt failing in exactly the same way. The machine simply refusing to deliver the shock, despite showing no clear signs of any actual technical malfunction that anyone present could identify in the moment. The patient continued declining throughout these repeated failed attempts, and despite everyone's continued efforts with CPR and every other available intervention, she eventually passed away. Her heart never successfully restarted despite the full resuscitation effort that her family's legal decision had required the medical team to perform. It was, understandably, a difficult and distressing situation for everyone present, made even stranger by the equipment failure that had made an already difficult situation feel even more chaotic and helpless than it already was. What happened immediately after her passing, though, is the part of this entire experience that has genuinely stayed with me more than almost anything else I witnessed during my entire nursing career. Almost the very instant she passed away, once the resuscitation effort had officially ended and the patient was confirmed deceased, someone on the code team, likely just going through standard post-event procedure, tested the same defibrillator that had failed repeatedly just moments before. This time, it worked completely normally, powering on and functioning exactly as it was designed to, showing no sign whatsoever of the malfunction that had prevented it from delivering a single shock throughout the entire resuscitation attempt just minutes earlier. This detail alone was enough to unsettle nearly everyone who had been present in that room. But what made it even stranger, and honestly what has stuck with me the most in all the years since, is what came out during the investigation that naturally followed such a significant and unusual equipment failure during an active resuscitation. Hospitals take defibrillator malfunctions during actual patient emergencies extremely seriously, given how critical that equipment is. And this particular hospital, like most, had a strict daily protocol requiring every defibrillator on every unit to be checked and tested each and every day specifically to prevent exactly this kind of failure from ever happening during a real emergency. According to what came out of that investigation, that specific defibrillator had been checked and tested that very same day, earlier during that same shift, exactly as required by hospital protocol, and had passed every single test completely normally, showing no indication whatsoever of any malfunction or technical issue that would explain why it later failed so completely and repeatedly during the actual resuscitation attempt, only to then work again perfectly, normally the moment it was tested once more immediately after the patient had already passed away. The biomedical engineering team that eventually reviewed the equipment afterward reportedly found nothing wrong with it either. No loose connection, no depleted battery, no software glitch or error code logged anywhere in its internal history that could account for what everyone in that room had personally witnessed it do, or rather, fail to do, during those critical minutes. I remember the staff who had been involved in that code, several of them nurses with far more experience than I had at that point as a student, saying afterward that in all their years of working in that hospital, they had never once seen anything like this happen with that equipment. a defibrillator failing completely during an actual emergency, despite passing its routine check that same day, and then immediately working perfectly again the moment it was tested afterward, once it was no longer actually needed. A couple of them, normally quite composed and unflappable given how much difficult experience they already had under their belts, admitted openly that the whole thing had genuinely rattled them in a way very little else on the job ever had before. In the end, despite the family having legally changed her code status against her own previously expressed wishes, and despite the full resuscitation effort that legal decision had required the medical team to perform, the patient ultimately ended up passing away exactly the way she herself had originally wanted, without ever actually receiving a single successful shock from that malfunctioning defibrillator, her body essentially reaching the same outcome her original DNR order would have guaranteed her, regardless of what her family had later decided to change on her behalf. Several of the nurses present that day quietly remarked to each other afterward that it almost felt as though her own original wishes had simply refused to be overruled. No matter what paperwork had been signed, or what legal authority had technically changed on record, everyone who had been present for that particular code talked about it quietly amongst themselves for a long time afterward, understandably shaken by how strange and specifically timed the entire equipment failure had turned out to be. Some of the more experienced nurses tried, in the days that followed, to walk through every possible rational explanation out loud, wondering about static electricity, a rare software bug, or some kind of extremely unusual battery issue that simply happened to resolve itself moments later. But none of these explanations ever seemed to fully satisfy anyone who brought them up, mostly because none of them accounted for the fact that the machine had already been tested and cleared that same day. Nobody on that unit had any real explanation for it beyond simple, uncomfortable coincidence, a piece of equipment malfunctioning at exactly the wrong, or perhaps exactly the right, moment, only to immediately return to full working order the instant it was no longer needed. But even calling it simple coincidence never felt entirely satisfying to those of us who had actually been standing in that room, watching it happen in real time. Especially once we learned just how thoroughly and recently that same machine had already been tested and confirmed to be working perfectly only hours before it suddenly, completely, and repeatedly failed at the one moment it mattered most. I have been a working nurse for more than 20 years now since that day, and I have witnessed plenty of unusual, difficult, and sometimes genuinely strange situations over the course of that career. The kind of things that tend to happen when you spend decades working closely with life and death on a near daily basis. But nothing else I have witnessed in all those years has ever come close to matching the specific strangeness of that particular defibrillator failure, occurring at exactly the moment it did, failing completely and repeatedly during the one emergency where a patient's own deeply held wishes were being overridden against her will, only to work again perfectly the instant those wishes were, in the end, somehow still honored regardless. I do not know what to make of it myself, even after all these years of turning it over in my mind. I am not someone who came into nursing believing strongly in anything beyond straightforward medical explanations for the things I witness at work, and generally speaking, I still approach most unusual situations in my career looking first and foremost for a rational, technical explanation before considering anything stranger. But I have never found one for this particular event. Not one that fully accounts for every single detail of what actually happened that day, and I suspect, at this point in my career, that I never will. All I know for certain is that everyone present that day walked away from it, deeply unsettled, and that even now, decades later, I still think about that patient and about that one specific piece of equipment that simply would not work. Right up until the exact moment it truly did not matter anymore whether it worked at all. I have told this story to a small number of fellow nurses over the years, usually only when the conversation naturally drifts towards strange things people have witnessed on the job. The kind of conversation that seems to happen fairly often among people who have spent decades working in hospitals, trading these kinds of quiet, unexplainable stories the way people in other professions might trade stories about close calls or narrow misses. Almost every time I tell it, the reaction is the same. A long pause, a slow shake of the head, and usually some version of the same question, asking whether I am certain the machine had genuinely been tested and passed its check earlier that same day. I always confirm that, yes, it had, exactly as required, and that detail alone always seems to be the part that stays with people the longest afterward. The fact that this was not some old, poorly maintained piece of equipment prone to failure, but a machine confirmed working perfectly only hours before it inexplicably refused to function during the one moment it mattered most. Whenever I think back on my career as a whole, all the patients I have cared for, and all the difficult moments I have witnessed over more than 2 decades of nursing, that particular day remains the one experience I have never been able to file away neatly alongside everything else. Most difficult moments in this profession, even the saddest ones, eventually settle into something you can understand and process. Painful, but explainable. This one never has, and I suspect even after everything else I go on to witness for the rest of my career, it never fully will. This isn't something I tell people about very often, but when I was little, maybe around 7 or 8 years old, I woke up one night to a banging sound coming from my window. At first, still groggy and half asleep, I figured it was probably just the wind, some ordinary gust rattling the glass the way wind sometimes does on a stormy night, and I tried to simply shrug it off and drift back to sleep the way any child would when startled awake by something that seemed easily explainable. I remember burrowing further under my blankets, telling myself in that sleepy, half-formed way children reason with themselves that it was nothing, that the noise would pass, that morning would come soon enough, and everything would feel ordinary again, the way it always had on every other ordinary night before this particular one. But then I started hearing footsteps in my room. My bedroom had a fairly large open area in front of my bed, big enough that you could actually walk around in a circle if you wanted to. Plenty of empty floor space between my bed and my dresser and the door, and that particular layout suddenly felt significant in a way it never had before as I lay there listening. You know the kind of sounds that are supposedly just the house settling. The ordinary creaks and pops that old houses make as temperatures shift throughout the night, sounds I had grown so used to over the years that I usually barely registered them at all. This didn't sound like that. It sounded distinctly like someone was actually walking, moving in a steady, deliberate pattern that seemed to circle around that open space in front of my bed, over and over, footstep after footstep, with a consistency that no ordinary house settling ever really has, a rhythm too even and too purposeful to be anything accidental or structural. I used to sleep with the radio playing softly in the background, a habit that usually helped me fall asleep more easily, filling the quiet of my room with something familiar and comforting. The low hum of music or talk radio, a constant presence that had always felt reassuring rather than unsettling in the past. At that exact moment, though, the radio happened to be playing an especially sad, depressing-sounding song. One I can't actually remember the name of even now, but one that still gives me chills whenever I happen to hear even a few notes of something similar playing somewhere unexpectedly. The melody slow and mournful, in a way that felt entirely wrong for the middle of the night, when everything, else in the room already felt so charged with fear. The combination of that particular song, mournful and slow, together with those steady circling footsteps, created an atmosphere in my room that felt genuinely wrong in a way I had never experienced before as a child. Something that went well beyond the ordinary fears kids sometimes have about shadows or the dark. That was when the real fears started to properly set in. On top of everything else, the room also seemed to be getting noticeably colder. A chill settling into the air around me that felt entirely disconnected from the actual season, or whatever the thermostat was set to that particular night. A cold that crept in gradually at first, and then seemed to intensify the longer I lay there, listening. Wide awake now, and fully alert to every small sound and sensation filling that dark room around me. I remember pulling my blankets up tighter around myself, trying to convince my racing young mind that everything happening was still somehow ordinary and explainable, even as every instinct I had was telling me clearly that something was very wrong. That this particular combination of sounds and sensations simply didn't add up to anything I could rationalize away the way I usually managed to talk myself out of ordinary childhood fears. Eventually, my fear reached the point where I simply couldn't stay in that bed any longer. I decided I needed to make a run for my parents' room, which was located down the hallway from mine, reasoning in that desperate childlike way that reaching them would mean safety, that nothing bad could possibly happen once I was close enough to wake them up and tell them what was happening. I remember lying there for what felt like several more minutes, gathering whatever courage I could manage, my heart already pounding hard against my ribs as I mentally prepared myself for the short but suddenly terrifying distance between my bed and my bedroom door. A distance that had never once felt dangerous to me before that particular night. I threw back my blankets and bolted from my bed, moving as quickly as my legs could carry me toward my bedroom door. But my path required me to pass directly through that same open area in front of my bed, the exact spot where those footsteps had seemingly been circling the entire time, and there was simply no way around it. No alternate route that would have let me avoid that particular stretch of floor. The instant I entered that space, the cold hit me with an intensity that felt almost physically impossible. So severe and so sudden that I could actually see my own breath forming in front of my face. A visible cloud of condensation hanging in air that should never have been cold enough to produce something like that inside my own bedroom, especially not in a house with working heating and no obvious draft or open window anywhere nearby. I froze completely, my whole body locking up for just a single, terrifying second, right in the middle of that impossibly cold patch of air, my legs simply refusing to obey whatever desperate command my mind was sending them to keep moving. And in that exact frozen moment, I heard two words spoken clearly, directly into that cold space around me, in a voice that wasn't my own and wasn't coming from the radio or anywhere else I could identify. A voice that sounded distinctly separate from any other sound in the room, cutting through the sad music still playing softly in the background with startling, unmistakable clarity. I'm lost. I don't know how to fully explain the specific quality of terror that gripped me in that instant, hearing those two simple words spoken so clearly and so close, surrounded by cold air that shouldn't have existed inside my own familiar bedroom. Whatever brief paralysis had held me in place shattered instantly, replaced by pure, overwhelming panic. And I bolted the rest of the way to my parents' room as fast as my small legs could possibly carry me, my heart pounding violently in my chest the entire way down that hallway, my bare feet slapping against the cold hallway floor as I ran without daring to look back over my shoulder even once. I burst into their room and immediately crawled underneath their bed, curling myself into the smallest, most hidden position I could manage in that cramped space. And I stayed there, silently crying, until I eventually cried myself into an exhausted sleep, still tucked beneath their bed frame long after my initial terror had at least partially subsided into something closer to quiet, lingering unease. I remember the specific comfort of hearing my parents' steady breathing somewhere above me as they continued sleeping, completely unaware of what had just happened just down the hallway. Their ordinary presence somehow enough to eventually calm my racing heart even without them ever knowing I was there, curled beneath them that entire night. I never told my parents what had actually happened that night. Not the specific details, anyway. I think even at that young age, some part of me understood that explaining exactly what I had heard and felt would be difficult. That adults tend to reach immediately for rational explanations involving nightmares or an overactive imagination, rather than genuinely considering that a frightened child's account of impossible, cold, and disembodied words might actually deserve to be taken seriously. So instead, I simply told them I'd had a bad dream, accepted their comforting reassurances without correction, and eventually made my way back to my own room once daylight arrived, and the ever-surging, the ordinary comfort of morning light made everything feel considerably less threatening than it had during those dark, terrifying hours overnight. I remember specifically how different my bedroom looked in the daylight. The same open floor space that had felt so charged with menace hours earlier now appearing completely ordinary. Sunlight streaming through the same window that had rattled with that initial banging sound. Everything looking so mundane and unremarkable that I almost managed to convince myself the entire experience had simply been an unusually vivid nightmare after all, at least until the following night arrived, and that same familiar unease began creeping back in as darkness fell once again. I have thought about that particular night many times over the years since it happened, turning the entire sequence of events over in my mind whenever the memory happens to resurface. Usually triggered by something as simple and unexpected as catching a few notes of a vaguely similar sounding sad song playing somewhere unexpectedly, or feeling an unusually sharp draft of cold air pass through a room for no immediately obvious reason. Even now, decades later, those two particular triggers, an unfamiliar sad melody or an inexplicable pocket of cold, are enough to send a small, involuntary shiver through me, my mind immediately flashing back to that specific night, despite how many years have passed since it originally happened. A reaction so consistent and so automatic that I have simply learned to accept it as a permanent, if fairly minor, part of how my mind continues processing that particular childhood experience, regardless of how much distance and adult perspective I have since gained. I have noticed, too, that this particular reaction has never once faded or weakened over time the way I might reasonably expect an old childhood fear to gradually soften with enough passing years, remaining just as immediate and just as visceral now, well into my adult life, as it apparently was during the months and years immediately following the actual incident itself, all those years ago. I have tried many times to construct some kind of rational explanation that would neatly account for everything I experienced that particular night. Some combination of childhood imagination, running wild, combined with an overactive sense of fear amplified by that particular sad song playing on the radio at exactly the wrong moment. My young mind simply weaving together an elaborate, frightening narrative out of ordinary house noises and an unfortunately timed piece of music. But no explanation I have ever managed to construct has fully satisfied me, has ever adequately accounted for that specific, undeniable cold. Cold enough to actually produce visible breath inside my own bedroom, or for those two clearly spoken words that I heard directly. words that I have never been able to convince myself I simply imagined or misheard in some panicked, half-asleep state. Children certainly do misremember things, certainly do sometimes construct elaborate narratives around ordinary, mundane events. And I try to remain honest with myself about that possibility whenever I revisit this particular memory as an adult, with a far better understanding of how unreliable childhood memory formed under stress can genuinely be. But the specific visceral memory of that cold air and those particular words has never faded or softened the way I might have expected an ordinary childhood nightmare to fade with enough distance and time, remaining just as sharp and just as vivid now as it apparently was on the actual night it happened. I have wondered, over the years, exactly what those two words might have meant, assuming there was genuine intention and communication behind them, rather than some random, meaningless auditory hallucination produced by my own frightened young mind. Was there genuinely some kind of presence in that house? Something that had somehow become disoriented or trapped within that particular space, circling endlessly around the same small area of my bedroom floor, searching for some way out or some form of resolution it simply couldn't find on its own? I have thought about this particular question from many different angles over the years, sometimes imagining that whatever I encountered that night might have belonged to someone who had once lived in that house long before my family ever moved in. Someone whose connection to that specific space had somehow persisted well beyond their own death, wandering in confused circles through a bedroom that may have once looked entirely different from the one I actually slept in as a child, back before whatever renovations or changes had reshaped that particular room over the years, between whatever original occupancy might have taken place and the point when my own family eventually settled into that house ourselves. I have never had any way of confirming whether the house itself was actually old enough or had a long enough history to make that particular theory plausible, given how limited my own research efforts into the property's background ultimately turned out to be. But the idea has always felt somehow fitting to me regardless. An intuitive explanation that seemed to match the particular quality of confusion and displacement carried in those two simple words. I have no way of actually confirming any specific theory I might construct, no additional evidence beyond that single, deeply unsettling childhood memory. But the specific phrasing of those two words has always struck me as genuinely significant somehow. Not threatening exactly, but rather sad, almost pleading. The words of something confused and disoriented rather than something malevolent or intentionally frightening. There was something in the particular tone of that voice, even now as I try to recall it decades later, that has always stayed with me as distinctly different from anything I would associate with genuine malice or threat. It sounded, if anything, almost childlike itself, small and uncertain. The voice of something genuinely lost rather than something hunting or stalking. I have tried many times to recall additional details about that voice, whether it sounded like it belonged to a man or a woman, whether it carried any particular accent or age to it. But honestly, those specific details have always remained frustratingly vague in my memory, overshadowed entirely by the sheer terror of the moment itself, and by the two words themselves, which have remained perfectly crystal clear, despite everything else about that voice fading gradually into uncertainty over the years since. That particular quality has always complicated my feelings about the entire experience in ways I have never fully resolved. Part of me remains genuinely frightened whenever I think back on that night, remembering the cold and the panic and the desperate sprint down that hallway. A fear that has never fully faded even decades later. But another part of me has always felt an unexpected flicker of something closer to sympathy, wondering whether whatever I encountered that night was suffering in its own confused, disoriented way, whether it needed help rather than posing any actual danger to me, even though my 7 or 8-year-old self certainly had no way of processing that particular nuance in the moment, reacting instead with pure, unfiltered childhood terror that left no room whatsoever for anything resembling compassion or curiosity at the time. I never experienced anything similar again in that particular bedroom. Not during the remaining years I continued living in that house throughout the rest of my childhood. Whatever had happened that one specific night seemed to be an isolated incident, never repeating itself in any way I ever personally witnessed again, though I admit I remained considerably more cautious and alert whenever I found myself alone in that room at night for a long while afterward, always half listening for the possibility of those same circling footsteps returning. For months following that experience, I remember avoiding that particular open floor space in front of my bed whenever possible, taking a slightly longer path around the perimeter of my room rather than walking directly through the middle of it. A small, private ritual that I never explained to anyone, but that felt genuinely necessary to me at the time. I also stopped falling asleep with the radio playing for quite a while afterward, unable to shake the association between that particular soft background music and the terror I had experienced that specific night. Eventually only feeling comfortable enough to reintroduce that old comforting habit many months later, once enough time had passed that the immediate sharpness of the memory had at least somewhat dulled, and even then I remember being especially careful, at least for a while, about which particular station or program I chose to fall asleep listening to. I remember, too, going through a period afterward where I insisted on sleeping with my bedroom door open and a small nightlight left on, changes to my usual routine that my parents accommodated without much question, likely assuming it was simply a fairly ordinary phase of childhood nervousness, rather than anything connected to a specific, genuinely frightening experience I had never actually told them about in full detail. That particular nightlight, a small plastic thing shaped like a star that plugged directly into the wall outlet near my dresser, became an object of genuine comfort for me during that period. Its soft glow filling just enough of my bedroom to keep that particular open floor space from ever feeling completely dark again, even on nights when nothing unusual happened at all. Looking back now, I sometimes wonder whether my parents ever noticed the specific timing of these behavioral changes, whether they connected my sudden new caution around bedtime routines to any particular incident, or whether they simply chalked it up to ordinary childhood development, the kind of temporary nervous phase that most kids seem to pass through at some point without any specific, identifiable cause behind it. I've shared this particular story with a small handful of close friends and family members over the years, always somewhat hesitantly, aware of exactly how strange and difficult to fully believe it must sound to anyone who wasn't actually there experiencing it firsthand as a frightened 7 or 8-year-old child. The reactions I typically receive vary considerably depending on who I happen to be talking to. Some people immediately offer practical, rational explanations, suggesting perhaps I simply had an unusually vivid and frightening dream, one so realistic that it left a lasting, distorted impression on my memory that I later mistook for genuine reality. A suggestion I understand completely, even as it has never fully satisfied my own sense of what actually happened that particular night, given how differently that particular memory has always felt compared to any of the many ordinary nightmares I remember experiencing throughout the rest of my own childhood. Others take the story considerably more seriously, asking detailed follow-up questions about the house's specific history, whether anything unusual had ever happened there before we moved in, questions I honestly have never been able to answer with any real confidence, given how young I was during that particular period, and how little I ever actually investigated the property's history myself. I did, at one point, many years later as an adult, make a brief, somewhat half-hearted attempt to look into the history of that specific house, curious whether any records existed regarding previous owners or any particular incidents connected to that address before my family moved in. Spending a few evenings searching through whatever local property records and old newspaper archives I could manage to access online. I never found anything especially conclusive. No dramatic story of tragedy or death specifically tied to that property that I could point to as definitive confirmation of what I experienced, though property records from that particular era in that particular region were admittedly somewhat difficult to access in any comprehensive way, with many older records simply never having been properly digitized or maintained in any easily searchable format. Part of me has always wondered whether a more thorough, dedicated investigation might have turned up something more concrete. But another part of me has never felt entirely comfortable pursuing it much further, worried perhaps that finding some specific tragic story attached to that house might make the whole experience feel even more genuinely real and unsettling than simply leaving it as an unexplained mystery from my childhood. A mystery I have, over the years, grown almost comfortable carrying without ever fully resolving. Looking back now, as an adult with considerably more life experience and perspective than I possessed as a frightened young child, I still find myself genuinely unable to fully dismiss that particular memory as simple imagination or an unusually vivid nightmare. There was something about the specific, layered combination of details. That particular sad, unidentifiable song playing at exactly the wrong moment. Those consistent circling footsteps moving through an otherwise ordinary open space in my bedroom, and especially that impossible, visible cold accompanied by those two clearly spoken words, that has always felt far too specific and far too vivid to easily categorize as nothing more than an overactive childhood imagination running away with itself in the middle of the night. Nightmares, in my own experience, both as a child and later as an adult, tend to fade fairly quickly upon waking, their specific details growing blurry and uncertain within hours or days of the actual dream itself occurring. This particular memory has never behaved that way, remaining sharp and consistent across every single retelling over the course of decades, never shifting or softening the way I would genuinely expect an ordinary childhood nightmare to shift and soften with enough passing time. I don't know what that presence actually was, assuming it genuinely existed at all outside my own frightened young mind, or why it happened to manifest in my particular bedroom on that particular night rather than any other night throughout the years I lived in that house. I don't know whether it was simply lost and confused, wandering endlessly through some small circular path within my bedroom, searching for something or someone it could never quite seem to find, or whether there is some entirely different, more mundane explanation I have simply never managed to properly consider or construct in all the years since. What I do know, with complete certainty, regardless of how strange or difficult to believe it might sound to anyone hearing it secondhand, is exactly what I personally experienced that particular night. The cold, the footsteps, the sad song playing steadily in the background, and those two haunting, quietly spoken words that have stayed with me, clear and unchanged, for every single year since. Even now, so many years removed from that particular childhood bedroom, I still find myself occasionally glancing toward empty corners of unfamiliar rooms, some small, persistent part of me still half expecting, in certain quiet, dark moments, to feel that same specific chill settle into the air around me, to hear those same two words spoken quietly into whatever darkness happens to surround me. It has never happened again, not in all the years since that particular night, But the memory itself has never fully released its grip on me either, remaining tucked away in some permanent corner of my mind, ready to resurface unexpectedly whenever the right combination of cold air and mournful music happens to align once more, however briefly, with that one distant, terrifying night from my early childhood. A night that has quietly shaped how I experience certain ordinary sounds and sensations ever since, without me ever fully intending it to. This particular story isn't actually my own experience. It was told to me by a former teacher of mine, someone I trusted and respected a great deal. A woman known throughout the school for her calm, practical demeanor and her tendency to approach nearly every situation with careful, level-headed reasoning. She has always sworn, every single time she has told it, that every detail of it is completely true, insisting she has never once exaggerated or embellished any part of the account, even decades after the events themselves originally took place. She explained that when she was still a child, she shared a bedroom with her younger sister, the two of them sleeping in separate beds within the same small room the way siblings close in age often do. Their bedroom arranged in a fairly ordinary way, with a shared closet and a single door leading out into the upstairs hallway of their family home. One particular night, she was lying awake in her own bed when her younger sister suddenly told her to look toward their bedroom door. She glanced up in that direction and saw the distinct silhouette of a man standing there, filling the doorway completely, tall and still and utterly silent, his shape outlined clearly against whatever faint light was coming from somewhere further down the hallway beyond their room. There was a light switch positioned conveniently right next to her bed, close enough that she could reach it without needing to get up or move any closer to that unsettling figure. And she immediately flipped it on, flooding the room with light to get a clearer look at whoever was standing there. The moment the light came on, there was nobody in the doorway. No man, no shadow, no sign whatsoever that anyone had ever actually been standing there just seconds earlier. Both girls, thoroughly frightened by what they had just witnessed, immediately called out for their father, their voices carrying that particular urgent, panicked tone that instantly alerts any parent that something is genuinely wrong. He came rushing into their room, still half-dressed, and clearly startled from being pulled so suddenly from his own sleep, asking them what had happened, what exactly had frightened them so suddenly in the middle of the night. They explained everything to him as clearly as two frightened children could manage, describing the tall silhouette standing in the doorway, the way it had simply vanished the instant the light came on. Their father, doing what most parents would probably do in that exact situation, tried to reassure them that it was likely nothing more than their own eyes playing tricks on them in the darkness, some trick of shadow and half-sleep that had simply appeared more solid and more frightening than it actually was. He checked the hallway, confirmed there was nobody else in the house who shouldn't have been there, glancing into every nearby room, and even briefly checking the front and back doors to make certain nothing had been left unlocked, and eventually settled both girls back down enough that they were able to fall back asleep, at least for the remainder of that particular night, though sleep did not come easily for either of them. The next morning, though, something happened that complicated her father's reassuring explanation considerably. My teacher went downstairs for breakfast the way she did every morning, expecting the usual ordinary start to her day, and found her father already sitting at the kitchen table, not eating, not reading the newspaper, simply staring off into space with an expression she had never quite seen on his face before. Something distant and unsettled that immediately caught her attention and made her pause in the doorway of the kitchen itself before saying anything. She asked him what was wrong, genuinely concerned by how out of character his behavior seemed that particular morning. He looked up at her, and after a brief pause, asked the question that has apparently stayed with her ever since. The exact phrasing burned permanently into her memory, despite everything that happened afterward in her long life. He asked, "Was the man you saw a tall man?" She confirmed that yes, the figure they had seen the night before had indeed been notably tall, its silhouette stretching almost the entire height of the doorway itself. Her father didn't offer any further explanation at that particular moment. Didn't elaborate on why he was asking that specific question, or what exactly had prompted him to bring it up so directly the following morning. He simply nodded slowly, seemingly lost once again in whatever private thoughts had been occupying him before she came downstairs. And the conversation moved on to more ordinary matters without any further discussion of the previous night's frightening incident. According to my teacher, this wasn't an isolated occurrence, a single strange event that happened once and was never repeated. She claims that every single member of her family, herself, her sister, her parents, even occasionally visiting relatives who stayed overnight, witnessed that same tall silhouette standing in various doorways throughout the house on numerous separate occasions over the course of many years, sometimes months apart, sometimes with longer stretches of complete normalcy in between that made each new sighting feel just as startling and unexpected as the very first one had been. Each time, the pattern remained remarkably consistent. Someone would notice the figure standing there, tall and silent, filling whatever doorway it happened to be occupying at that particular moment. Whether that was the children's shared bedroom door, the doorway leading into the master bedroom, or occasionally even the entrance to the upstairs bathroom during late-night trips down the hallway. The figure apparently showing no particular preference for any single specific doorway over the years, simply appearing wherever it happened to appear on any given occasion without any obvious pattern connecting the various specific locations together. They would reach for the nearest light switch, and the instant the light came on, the figure would already be gone, vanished completely, leaving behind no trace whatsoever that anyone had ever actually been standing there. My teacher mentioned that her sister, in particular, developed a specific habit over the years of sleeping with her back deliberately turned toward the bedroom door. A small, private precaution she maintained well into her teenage years, long after most children would have outgrown any lingering fear of things seen in the dark. A habit that apparently persisted even after the two sisters eventually moved into separate bedrooms once their family renovated part of the upstairs floor plan. My teacher herself, by contrast, apparently developed the opposite habit, preferring instead to keep her own eyes trained on that doorway for as long as she could manage to stay awake each night, telling me once that she always felt, somewhat irrationally perhaps, that watching the door directly gave her some small measure of control over whatever might eventually appear there, even though every single sighting over the years had ended the exact same way regardless of who happened to be watching or not watching at the time, the figure appearing and vanishing on its own apparent schedule, entirely independent of anyone's individual precautions or habits. I remember sitting in my teacher's classroom, well after regular school hours had ended, listening to her recount this particular story with a level of genuine conviction that made it impossible for me to simply dismiss it as some elaborate work of fiction crafted purely for entertainment. She wasn't the type of person who typically embellished stories or exaggerated for dramatic effect. Someone known throughout the school for being level-headed and practical in nearly every other aspect of her personality and teaching style. The kind of teacher who assigned careful, well-structured lessons and rarely, if ever, indulged in idle gossip or exaggerated classroom anecdotes the way some other teachers occasionally did. Hearing her describe this particular experience with such quiet, matter-of-fact seriousness made the whole account considerably more unsettling than it might have been coming from someone more prone to theatrical storytelling. I remember her voice actually dropping slightly, becoming quieter and more measured, as she reached the specific part about her father's question the next morning. A small shift in tone that has always stuck with me as evidence of just how genuinely this particular memory still affected her, even so many years after it originally happened. I have thought about this particular story many times over the years since she first told it to me, always circling back to that specific detail about her father's question the following morning. There is something genuinely chilling about the implication buried within that simple question. Was the man you saw a tall man? It suggests, without ever explicitly stating it outright, that her father had experienced something similar himself at some earlier point. Something he had apparently never shared with his own children until that particular silhouette sighting forced the subject unavoidably into the open. I have always wondered exactly what he might have seen previously, whether it had happened once, long before his children were even born, or whether he too had witnessed that same tall figure on multiple separate occasions throughout his own life within that particular house, choosing for whatever personal reason to keep those experiences entirely private rather than alarming his family unnecessarily. My teacher herself admitted that she never worked up the nerve to press her father further on the subject, either that particular morning or at any point in the years that followed, sensing somehow, even as a young child, that this was a topic he genuinely didn't want to discuss any further than that single, pointed question. What strikes me most about this particular story, beyond even the basic details of the sighting itself, is the specific pattern that apparently repeated itself so consistently over such an extended period of time. A tall, silent silhouette appearing in a doorway, always disappearing the instant a light switch was flipped, never once caught directly in the act of vanishing. Never once explained through any obvious rational cause, like a trick of shadow from outside streetlights, or some ordinary household object briefly mistaken for a human shape in the darkness. The sheer consistency of that pattern, repeated across multiple family members and multiple separate incidents spanning many years, has always struck me as considerably more difficult to dismiss than a single isolated sighting might have been. A single strange occurrence could easily be attributed to any number of ordinary explanations. A half-remembered dream, a genuine trick of shadow and light, simple childhood suggestion feeding off itself in the dark, the kind of thing skeptics reasonably reach for first. But an entire family, multiple different individuals across multiple separate years, all describing essentially the exact same experience under essentially the exact same circumstances, feels considerably harder to simply wave away as coincidence or overactive imagination. I asked my teacher during that same conversation when she first told me this story whether the family had ever tried to investigate further, whether they had considered looking into the house's history to determine if anything unusual had happened there before her family moved in. She mentioned that her parents had made some limited inquiries over the years, though nothing especially conclusive ever came from that particular effort. The house itself was reasonably old by the standards of that particular area, having passed through several previous owners before her family eventually purchased it. But no specific dramatic history of tragedy or violence connected to the property ever surfaced through whatever research they managed to conduct. She mentioned that her mother had, at one point, tried asking some of the longer-term neighbors on their street whether they knew anything about the house's earlier history, receiving mostly vague, unhelpful responses beyond general confirmation that the property had changed hands a handful of times over the decades before her own family ever moved in, none of the neighbors offering any specific stories or details that might have explained the recurring sightings in any concrete, satisfying way. One elderly neighbor, according to what my teacher recalled her mother mentioning afterward, had simply grown quiet and changed the subject entirely once the specific topic of that particular house came up, a reaction that, in hindsight, has always struck my teacher as potentially significant, though nobody in her family ever pushed the woman further to explain her own apparent discomfort with the question. She also mentioned that despite how frequently these sightings apparently occurred throughout her childhood, the family never once felt genuinely threatened or endangered by the presence, whatever it actually was. The figure never moved, never spoke, never did anything beyond simply standing silently in various doorways before disappearing the moment anyone attempted to get a better look at it. There was something almost patient about its apparent behavior, content simply to be occasionally glimpsed, rather than actively pursuing any kind of interaction or confrontation with the family members who happened to notice it standing there. My teacher told me that, strange as it might sound, the family eventually developed a kind of uneasy familiarity with these occasional sightings. Never quite comfortable with them exactly, but also never living in genuine ongoing fear the way you might expect a family repeatedly encountering something so seemingly unexplainable to feel over such an extended period. I have wondered, over the years since first hearing this particular story, whether that specific detail, the complete lack of any aggressive or threatening behavior despite repeated sightings over such an extended period, might actually be significant in its own right. Whatever that tall silhouette actually represented, it never seemed interested in causing harm or even actively frightening anyone beyond the natural startlement that comes from unexpectedly glimpsing an unfamiliar human-shaped figure standing silently in your bedroom doorway in the middle of the night. It simply appeared, stood there briefly, and then vanished the moment attention was properly directed toward it, almost as though it existed specifically to be occasionally noticed, rather than to interact in any more meaningful or threatening way with the people who happen to live in that particular house. I've sometimes wondered whether this particular quality, this apparent patience and lack of any genuine malice, might be part of what allowed the family to continue living comfortably in that same house for so many years, despite the sightings, rather than moving away entirely the way a family might reasonably do if they genuinely felt endangered by whatever presence they kept encountering. My teacher eventually moved away from that childhood home once she reached adulthood, the way most people eventually do, and she mentioned that she has no idea whether the current occupants of that house, whoever they might be now, have ever experienced anything similar themselves. She has never returned to specifically ask, understandably reluctant to show up at a stranger's front door, asking whether they had perhaps noticed a tall, silent figure occasionally appearing in their doorways late at night, a conversation she admitted would likely sound completely absurd coming from a stranger, with no obvious connection to the property beyond having once lived there decades earlier as a child. I imagine if she ever did work up the nerve to ask that particular question, the reaction she would likely receive would range anywhere from confused dismissal to, perhaps, a startled recognition that would confirm once and for all that whatever her family experienced throughout those years wasn't simply confined to their own particular time living in that house. She did mention, half joking, but with a certain seriousness underneath the humor, that she has occasionally considered driving past that old house whenever she happens to be in the area visiting other relatives, though she has never actually stopped or approached the current owners directly, content instead to simply glance at the familiar exterior from the safety and distance of her passing car. I have shared this story with several other people over the years since my teacher first told it to me, always somewhat hesitantly, aware of exactly how strange and difficult to fully believe it must sound coming secondhand from someone who never personally witnessed any of it firsthand. The reactions I typically receive tend to fall along fairly predictable lines. Some people immediately reach for rational explanations, suggesting that childhood fear and suggestion, especially once one sibling claims to see something frightening, can easily convince another sibling they saw the exact same thing. A documented psychological phenomenon that certainly could account for at least some portion of what my teacher and her sister experienced during that very first sighting. Others take the story considerably more seriously, particularly once I mention the detail about her father's specific question the following morning. A detail that tends to shift people's reactions noticeably toward genuine unease rather than simple skepticism. That single, unguarded moment, somehow doing more to convince listeners of the story's authenticity than any of the actual sighting. Descriptions themselves. I have noticed, over the many times I have told this particular story to different people, that the reaction almost always shifts the moment I reach that specific detail about the father sitting quietly at the kitchen table, asking his careful, pointed question before falling silent again. That single small moment somehow carrying more emotional weight than any of the actual sighting descriptions themselves ever seem to manage on their own. Something about that particular image, an adult, someone who should theoretically have all the answers and all the reassurance a frightened child could need, instead appearing genuinely shaken and uncertain himself, tends to land with people in a way that the initial sighting description alone doesn't always manage to accomplish on its own. It suggests a depth to the story that goes beyond simple childhood imagination, hinting at some larger, unexplained history that the story itself never fully resolves or explains, no matter how many times it gets retold over the years. I don't personally know what to make of this particular story myself, even after all these years of periodically thinking back on it. I never witnessed anything even remotely similar in my own life, and I have no way of independently verifying any specific detail beyond simply trusting my former teacher's sincere, consistent account of what she and her family apparently experienced together over the course of many years. What I do know is that she never once, across the several occasions she brought this story up over the years I knew her, wavered from the exact same core details: the tall silhouette, the light switch, the sudden disappearance, and that specific chilling question her father asked her the following morning. A consistency that has always struck me as meaningful in its own right, regardless of whatever ultimate explanation might actually account for what her family repeatedly witnessed. Most people, when retelling a story multiple times over the course of years, especially a story rooted in early childhood memory, tend to introduce small variations, shifting details, embellishments that creep in gradually without the storyteller even fully realizing it. The natural drift that comes from human memory, reshaping itself slightly with each new retelling. My teacher's account never showed any of that natural drift, remaining remarkably stable and consistent every single time she happened to bring it up, regardless of how many years passed between one telling and the next. I think about that particular detail most of all. The image of her father sitting alone at the kitchen table the morning after, clearly troubled by something, asking that single pointed question before falling silent again. It suggests an entire history that was never fully explained to his own children, some earlier personal experience he apparently carried privately for who knows how many years before that particular sighting forced him to finally acknowledge, however briefly and incompletely, that something genuinely unexplainable had been present in that house long before his own children ever encountered it themselves. I have wondered more than once whether he might have grown up in that same house himself or in a similar house elsewhere, whether this particular kind of experience was something that had actually followed him personally rather than being tied specifically to that one property. A question my teacher herself was never able to answer with any confidence. Given how thoroughly her father apparently kept whatever he knew or suspected entirely to himself, right up until his own passing many years later, taking whatever specific personal history he carried regarding that particular tall silhouette permanently with him, rather than ever sharing it fully with his own children. Even once they had grown into adulthood themselves, and might reasonably have, entrusted with a more complete explanation. I have never forgotten this story since my teacher first shared it with me, and I doubt I ever will. There is something about the specific, quiet consistency of it, the repeated sightings across so many years, the identical pattern each and every time, the complete absence of any aggressive intent from whatever that figure actually represented, that has stayed with me in a way few other stories ever have. Every time I happen to glance toward a darkened doorway in an unfamiliar house, some small part of me can't help but think back to that particular tall, silent silhouette, wondering whether somewhere out there, in some house I will never actually visit myself, that same patient figure might still be quietly appearing in doorways, waiting to be noticed before disappearing once again the very instant someone finally reaches for the light. I have also found myself over the years thinking about my teacher's own sister, wondering what that particular relationship might have looked like as the two of them grew older, sharing such a strange and specific secret between them that neither one could ever fully explain to anyone outside their immediate family. I imagine there must have been a certain kind of bond forged between them through that shared experience, a private understanding that connected them in a way most siblings never quite experience, even siblings who remain close throughout their entire lives together. My teacher mentioned in passing that she and her sister still occasionally discussed that particular tall silhouette even as adults, comparing notes on their individual memories of specific sightings, sometimes discovering small discrepancies in exactly how many times each of them had personally witnessed the figure over the years, though the core details themselves, the height, the silence, the disappearance the moment a light came on, always remained perfectly consistent between the two of them, regardless of any minor variation in the specific number or timing of individual sightings. A consistency that always seemed to reassure both sisters, in its own strange way, that neither of them had simply imagined the whole thing on their own. I sometimes wondered, too, what became of that particular house after my teacher's family eventually moved away, whether it has changed hands multiple times since then, whether any subsequent family living there ever experienced anything even remotely similar to what my teacher's family apparently lived alongside for so many years, or whether whatever presence occupied those doorways somehow departed permanently once the family most closely connected to it finally left for good. There is a particular kind of unresolved curiosity that comes with hearing a story like this secondhand, knowing you will likely never have any way of following up, never any realistic path toward learning whether the phenomenon continued after the specific family who experienced it originally moved on to somewhere else entirely, leaving that particular house and whatever quietly lived within it behind for whoever happened to move in next, a mystery that will likely remain permanently unresolved for me personally, just as it apparently remained unresolved for my teacher and her own family throughout all their years living there. During my junior year of high school, I had a pretty ordinary routine most days after classes ended. I would get off the school bus a couple of stops early and walk the rest of the way to a friend's house instead of going straight home, spending an hour or two hanging out and playing video games before eventually heading back to my own place for the evening. It was a small, harmless habit, nothing my parents had ever explicitly forbidden, though I never made a huge point of announcing it either. Just one of those minor teenage routines that existed somewhere in the gray area between fully approved and technically unremarked upon, the kind of small independence most teenagers start claiming for themselves around that age without much conscious thought about it. On this particular afternoon, we were in the middle of a video game session at my friend's house when his mom suddenly walked in holding the phone out toward me, telling me my own mother was on the line and needed to speak with me. I remember feeling that immediate familiar drop in my stomach that comes from getting an unexpected call from a parent while you're somewhere you're not technically supposed to be at that exact moment, already running through possible excuses in my head for why I hadn't come straight home. When I got on the phone, my mother's voice was sharp and urgent, telling me to come home immediately. I figured I had simply been caught skipping my usual direct route home and was about to get the standard lecture about telling her where I actually was after school. But something in her tone struck me as different from the usual mild irritation I might have expected for something so minor. She sounded genuinely frightened, not just annoyed. A distinction that stuck with me even as I hurriedly said goodbye to my friend and started making my way home as quickly as I could, my mind already racing through possible explanations for why she might sound that particular kind of scared rather than simply irritated with me. When I finally walked through the front door, the atmosphere inside the house immediately confirmed that something considerably more serious than my minor detour had happened while I was gone. My mother, my sister, and my sister's friend were all sitting together, and every one of them looked visibly shaken, the kind of frazzled, unsettled energy that comes from having just experienced something genuinely upsetting rather than simply being annoyed at ordinary teenage behavior. Their expressions carrying a particular hollowed-out quality that immediately told me something considerably more significant than a missed curfew had happened while I was out. My mother turned to me immediately, her questions coming out fast and pointed, demanding to know exactly where I had been and what I had been doing after school that day. Her voice carrying an edge of genuine distress rather than the ordinary irritation I would have expected for something as minor as a missed direct route home. An edge that made it immediately clear something considerably more significant than my usual small routine had happened while I was gone. I told her the truth, that I had gone straight to my friend's house after getting off the bus early and had stayed there the entire time playing video games. Nothing unusual or different from plenty of other afternoons before that one. She didn't believe me, not even a little bit. She pressed harder, asking again and again in slightly different ways, clearly searching for some inconsistency in my story that would reveal I was actually lying about my whereabouts. Her repeated questioning, taking on an almost desperate quality as though she genuinely needed my story to eventually crack and reveal some hidden truth she was convinced must be lurking underneath my consistent, unchanging answer. Eventually, frustrated by my consistent answer and apparently unwilling to accept it, she sent me to my room, still visibly unsettled by whatever had actually happened that afternoon while I was gone. A few minutes later, my sister came into my room and asked me the exact same set of questions our mother had just put me through, wanting to know precisely where I had been and what I had been doing after school. I gave her the same honest answer I had given our mother, genuinely confused at this point by the sheer intensity of the interrogation over something as mundane as my after-school whereabouts, wondering privately what could possibly have happened that had everyone acting so strangely and asking me the same basic questions over and over again as though repetition alone might somehow produce a different, more satisfying answer. I finally asked her directly why everyone was acting so strange and clearly freaked out about something I still didn't understand at all. What she told me next has stayed with me vividly ever since. One of those specific family stories that gets brought up periodically over the years, always retold with the same slightly disbelieving tone, even by the people who actually lived through it firsthand. the details never quite softening or shifting the way ordinary family stories tend to over time, remaining sharp and specific no matter how many times it gets retold at holiday gatherings or quiet family conversations. While I had been at my friend's house completely unaware of any of this unfolding, my mother had apparently heard a voice, clear as day, calling out my name from somewhere outside. The sound drifting in through her open bedroom window while she was folding laundry or tidying up. Some ordinary domestic task that had nothing whatsoever to do with anything unusual until that specific moment. She looked outside toward our backyard to investigate, and what she saw made her heart drop immediately. There was my sister's friend, and a shirtless guy standing behind my sister's friend, his arms wrapped around her in an unmistakable hug from behind. The whole scene visible clearly through the window from her particular vantage point on the second floor of our house. Close enough and clear enough in that bright afternoon light that she has always insisted there was no possibility whatsoever of mistaking what she was looking at. No ambiguity in the image at all beyond the eventual impossible disappearance of the figure once she actually went to confront it directly. My mother was absolutely certain, without any hesitation whatsoever, that the shirtless guy she was looking at was me. She was so convinced of this that she immediately marched outside, fully prepared to reprimand me for behaving inappropriately toward my sister's friend, embarrassed and angry in that particular way parents get when they catch their teenager doing something they clearly shouldn't be doing, especially something involving physical affection toward a friend of a sibling, already rehearsing in her mind exactly what she planned to say to me the moment she reached the backyard and confronted me directly about it. But when she actually stepped outside into the backyard, there was no shirtless guy anywhere to be seen. Just my sister and her friend, standing there together, completely alone. No third person, no sign whatsoever that anyone else had been present just moments earlier. No sound of anyone running away or ducking behind the fence or slipping quickly back into the house through a side door. My mother, understandably confused and increasingly alarmed by this sudden discrepancy, refused to simply accept that she had somehow imagined the entire thing. She had heard a distinct male voice calling out my name. She had seen a shirtless male figure standing directly behind her, hugging my sister's friend. These weren't vague, easily dismissed impressions. They were clear, specific observations that had happened in broad daylight, in her own backyard, only moments before she stepped outside to investigate further. Convinced that the girls were simply covering for me, that I must have somehow slipped away and hidden myself somewhere on the property the instant she started walking toward the backyard, my mother began interrogating both my sister and her friend intensely, demanding to know exactly where I had gone, insisting that I must be hiding somewhere nearby, perhaps ducked behind the shed or crouched low behind the fence line at the edge of the yard. Both girls, equally confused and increasingly distressed by my mother's insistence on a version of events that simply hadn't happened, kept telling her the same thing, that it had only ever been the two of them out there the entire time, that no third person, shirtless or otherwise, had ever actually been present in that backyard with them. My mother searched the yard herself at one point, checking behind bushes and around the corner of the garage, growing more frustrated and more confused with every passing minute that failed to produce any sign of me actually being there. This entire confusing, unsettling sequence of events was what greeted me when I finally walked through the front door after rushing home from my friend's house, everyone still trying to process what had just happened, and clearly unable to reach any kind of agreement about what exactly had actually taken place in that backyard just a short while earlier. My mother, still shaken and clearly rattled, looked at me almost accusingly when I first walked in, as though some part of her still expected me to somehow explain away the whole confusing sequence of events, to reveal some clever explanation for how I had apparently been standing right there in our backyard mere minutes earlier, and yet was now walking through the front door, having supposedly been at my friend's house the entire time. An explanation I simply didn't have to offer her. My sister, meanwhile, seemed considerably more shaken than angry, her expression carrying a genuine, unsettled quality that told me this wasn't simply another instance of our mother overreacting to something ordinary, whatever had actually happened out there. My sister herself seemed just as confused and unsettled by our mother's insistence on a version of events that contradicted everything she and her friend had personally experienced during that same stretch of time. A discrepancy that clearly troubled her almost as much as it troubled our mother, even though she was on the opposite side of the disagreement about what had actually taken place. Here's where the story takes its genuinely chilling turn. The part that transforms this from a simple, confusing family misunderstanding into something considerably more unsettling once all the pieces finally came together. My sister's friend had come over that particular afternoon, specifically because she needed someone to talk to, carrying a heavy personal weight that neither my mother nor I had any awareness of at the time. That day happened to be the exact 1-year anniversary of her fiancé's suicide, a devastating loss she was still very much grieving and processing even a full year later. The kind of grief that never fully resolves itself neatly within any particular time frame, resurfacing with especially sharp intensity around significant dates like anniversaries, birthdays, and other markers that carry particular emotional weight for anyone still working through the aftermath of losing someone they loved that deeply and that suddenly. And her fiancé, the man she had lost exactly 1 year earlier to the day, shared my exact same name. Her fiancé had struggled, apparently, for some time before his death, and my sister's friend had confided in my sister more than once over the preceding year about how difficult these particular kinds of anniversary dates tended to be for her, needing simply the company and quiet support of a close friend to help her get through those especially heavy days. My mother had absolutely no context whatsoever regarding any of this when she looked out her bedroom window and saw that shirtless male figure standing in our backyard, his arms wrapped around my sister's friend from behind. She had no idea about the anniversary, no idea about the tragic loss my sister's friend was still actively mourning, no idea that the name she had heard called out through her open window belonged not only to her own son, but also, devastatingly, to a young man who had taken his own life exactly 1 year earlier that same day, a coincidence so precise it still strikes everyone in our family as almost too specific to be purely accidental whenever we discuss it now. She had simply reacted the way any mother would, hearing her child's name called out and immediately assuming she would find her own son standing in her backyard, her mind never once considering any alternative explanation, because she had absolutely no reason to. I have thought about this particular story countless times over the years since it happened, turning over every specific detail whenever it resurfaces in family conversation, which it still occasionally does even now, so many years later, usually surfacing unexpectedly during some unrelated family gathering when the conversation happens to drift towards strange, unexplainable personal experiences. My mother has never wavered from her account, has never once suggested that perhaps she simply misread the situation or briefly mistook some ordinary shadow or trick of afternoon light for an actual person standing there. She remains completely certain to this very day that she saw a real, physical, shirtless man standing in that backyard, hugging my sister's friend from behind, and that she heard his voice, clear and unmistakable, calling out my specific name through her open bedroom window. What makes this particular story especially unsettling, at least to me, is the specific combination of details that came together in that single moment. My mother had absolutely no way of knowing about the significance of that particular day. No way of knowing about my sister's friend's tragic loss. No way of knowing that the young man who had died exactly 1 year earlier shared my exact name. She wasn't primed in any way to expect or imagine seeing anything unusual that afternoon. She was simply going about her ordinary day, glanced out her window in response to hearing her own son's name called out, and witnessed something that, by every account she has ever given, appeared completely real and physically present in that moment, only to vanish entirely by the time she actually made it outside to investigate further. I have asked my sister and her friend about this particular afternoon many times over the years since it happened, always curious whether either of them ever noticed anything unusual themselves during that specific conversation in the backyard. Any strange sensation or feeling that might have suggested something beyond the two of them was actually present with them at the time. Neither of them has ever reported experiencing anything unusual from their own perspective. No sense of an additional presence. No unexpected chill or feeling of being watched. Nothing beyond the ordinary. Private conversation they were having together as my sister's friend worked through the difficult emotions surrounding that particular anniversary. Whatever my mother witnessed from her bedroom window, it apparently existed entirely within her own specific line of sight, visible to nobody else present in that backyard at the time, including, most strikingly, the very person that figure was apparently embracing. My sister has told me on more than one occasion that this particular detail has always struck her as the strangest and most difficult part of the entire story to process. Her friend was, according to every account both of them have ever given, standing right there, receiving whatever comfort or presence that figure apparently represented. And yet she herself felt absolutely nothing unusual in that moment. No physical sensation whatsoever suggesting anyone besides my sister was actually there with her. It raises an obvious, unanswerable question about who or what was actually meant to perceive that particular presence. Why my mother? Someone with no direct emotional connection to the tragedy being marked that day would be the one to witness something so specifically and personally significant to someone else entirely, rather than the friend herself, the person who would presumably have had the strongest emotional connection to whatever that presence actually represented. I have sometimes wondered whether there is some kind of protective mechanism at work in situations like this. Some reason why the person most directly connected to a loss might be shielded, consciously or otherwise, from directly perceiving something that could prove overwhelming to confront head-on, while someone standing at a slight remove, connected only by a shared name and a coincidental glance out a window, ends up witnessing it instead. This is, admittedly, pure speculation on my part, the kind of theory I have constructed simply trying to make some sense of an experience that otherwise defies any comfortable, straightforward explanation I have ever managed to come up with over the many years I have spent thinking about it since. My sister's friend, once she eventually learned the full details of what my mother claimed to have witnessed, reacted with a complicated mixture of emotions that I don't think any of us were fully prepared for at the time. There was obvious shock, understandably, at hearing that someone had apparently seen a figure resembling her deceased fiancé standing directly behind her on the exact anniversary of his death, embracing her in the exact way he might once have done during the time they were actually together. But there was also something that looked almost like comfort mixed into that shock. A strange, quiet solace in the idea that perhaps some part of him had genuinely found his way back to her during that particular difficult day, even if she herself had no conscious awareness of his presence at the time it apparently happened. I have wondered, many times since, exactly what to make of the specific timing involved in this entire story. If my mother had happened to glance out that window at any other moment, before or after that particular embrace apparently took place, would she have seen anything at all? Or would that entire encounter have simply gone completely unwitnessed by anyone, existing only within whatever realm allowed it to occur in the first place? The fact that she happened to look outside at precisely the right moment, drawn specifically by hearing a name that carried such unexpected, tragic significance for my sister's friend, has always struck me as almost too precisely timed to be pure coincidence. Though I recognize how difficult it is to draw any firm conclusion from something as inherently unverifiable as the exact timing of an unexpected glance out a bedroom window. My mother has never fully recovered from how unsettling that particular afternoon felt to her, even now that she understands the full context surrounding what she witnessed. She has mentioned, on more than one occasion over the years, that hearing the specific male voice calling out my name remains the single most vivid and disturbing detail of the entire experience for her, more unsettling even than the visual image of the shirtless figure standing in our backyard. She has said that the voice sounded completely convincing, completely real, indistinguishable in any way from an actual living person calling out to get her attention, which is precisely why she reacted with such immediate certainty and confidence that she was looking at her own son, rather than questioning, even briefly, whether something else entirely might be happening in that backyard that afternoon. She has told me more than once that even years later, she still sometimes finds herself briefly glancing toward that same section of the backyard whenever she happens to be near that particular window. A small, involuntary habit she has never quite managed to fully shake, despite how much time has passed since that original afternoon, always half expecting, in some small, persistent corner of her mind, that she might catch another glimpse of that same figure standing there again, even though nothing remotely similar has ever happened again since that one specific day. I don't have any tidy explanation to offer for what actually happened that particular afternoon, no satisfying theory that fully accounts for every specific detail my mother has consistently described over the years since it occurred. What I do know is that my mother, a fundamentally practical, unimaginative person by nature, someone who has never previously nor since claimed to experience anything remotely similar to this one specific incident, remains completely convinced all these years later that she witnessed something genuinely inexplicable that day. Something that only made sense, in the most unsettling way possible, once the full context of my sister's friend's tragic loss finally came to light. Whatever actually happened in that backyard on that specific anniversary, involving that specific name, has remained, for our entire family, one of those stories that resists any comfortable, complete explanation, surfacing periodically in conversation even now, always followed by that same brief, uncomfortable silence that settles over the room whenever we're reminded just how strange that particular afternoon genuinely was. I've thought, too, about how differently this entire situation might have unfolded if my mother had never actually gone outside to confront who she believed was me. If she had simply watched from the window without intervening at all, staying quietly upstairs a moment longer, before eventually deciding on her own to head downstairs and outside. Would the figure have remained visible longer, continued that quiet embrace for some additional length of time before eventually fading away on its own? Or was its disappearance directly tied to the moment my mother's presence and attention shifted from passive observation into active intervention? These are questions I recognize will never actually be answered, with any certainty, existing purely as speculation born from turning this particular story over so many times in my own mind over the years since it happened, unable to fully let it rest despite how many years have now passed. I have also found myself wondering, on occasion, whether other family members present that particular day carry any additional details or impressions I have simply never thought to ask about directly. My sister was quite young at the time, relative to how vividly she recalls certain other family memories from that same general period. And I sometimes wonder whether there might be small fragments of that afternoon she has never fully articulated. Impressions or half-remembered sensations that never quite crystallized into anything specific enough to mention outright, but that nonetheless lingers somewhere in the back of her memory from that particular day. Small details that might never surface unless someone happened to ask exactly the right question in exactly the right way during one of our occasional conversations about that afternoon. What has always struck me most, when I really sit with this story and consider it fully, is how completely ordinary everything about that afternoon was, up until the exact moment my mother glanced out her window. Nothing about the hours leading up to that point offering any hint whatsoever of what was about to unfold. Nothing about the day leading up to that point suggested anything unusual was about to happen. It was simply an ordinary school day, an ordinary after-school routine, an ordinary visit from a family friend seeking some quiet company and conversation during a genuinely difficult personal anniversary. Nothing about any of it distinguishing that particular afternoon from countless other unremarkable days before it. And then, for reasons none of us have ever been able to fully explain, something briefly, inexplicably crossed over into that ordinary afternoon, visible to exactly one person for exactly long enough to be witnessed and remembered, before vanishing completely and leaving behind nothing but confusion, questions, and a story our family has continued telling and retelling ever since. One that still manages to raise the hair on my arms every single time it comes up. Again